Hey guys, tonight we're talking about Joan of Arc, the teenage girl who claimed she was sent by God, led armies into battle, and changed the course of history before she was even 20. Before you settle in, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if watching this helps you relax and drift off with a calm mind. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing where people are tuning in from across the country and around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on the AC for that cool, steady background hum. And let's step back in time together into a world of faith, fire, and destiny. If you had wandered into the little village of Domrémy in the early 1400s, you wouldn't have guessed you were in one of the most war-torn countries in Europe. At first glance, it was just another cluster of houses along the Meuse River, where cows grazed lazily, church bells rang on Sundays, and the biggest scandal might be whose chickens wandered into whose garden. But the quiet was deceptive. France was in the grip of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had been dragging on for decades between the French and the English, with the occasional Burgundian ally making things worse. The war was like a shadow over everything. Even if you didn't see soldiers that day, you knew they were out there, somewhere beyond the fields, raiding, burning, and demanding taxes that the villagers could barely pay. Domrémy itself was technically loyal to the French crown, but it sat dangerously close to the border of Burgundian-controlled territory. That meant skirmishes could appear with little warning, and peace could vanish in the time it took a horse to gallop into the square. It was in this unsettled, uneasy corner of France that a girl named Joan was born around 1412. She was the daughter of Jacques d'Arc, a farmer who also worked as a minor village official, and Isabelle Romy, a deeply devout woman who taught her children the prayers of the church before they could even read. Joan had 3 brothers and a sister, and by all accounts, she grew up in a tight-knit religious household. Like most children in Domrémy, Joan learned to work from a young age. She tended sheep, spun wool, and helped with planting and harvest. She was said to be strong and healthy, but more than that, she was serious. Not sullen or unfriendly, but the sort of girl who listened more than she spoke. And when she did speak, it was with a quiet certainty. Life in the village was simple, but far from idyllic. Stories of battles and pillaging reached Domrémy often, and sometimes the war came frighteningly close. Joan's own family had to flee once when soldiers approached, abandoning their home to seek safety in another village. For children, the war wasn't a far-off tale. It was the reason food could be scarce, why fathers didn't always return from market trips, why strangers could suddenly appear in the night. But despite the turmoil, Domrémy was steeped in faith. The village church was the heart of community life, and its priest was as important as any political leader. Joan grew up surrounded by images of saints, crucifixes, and the rituals of the Mass. The people of Domrémy believed deeply in heaven and hell, sin and salvation. For Joan, faith wasn't an idea, it was the air she breathed. Those who knew her as a child remembered her piety. She attended church often, confessed regularly, and had a reputation for giving to the poor, even when her own family had little to spare. And unlike most children her age, she seemed drawn to moments of silence and contemplation. Still, she was a girl of her time. She could laugh, sing, and join in the village dances when the mood struck. But there was something in her eyes, people said later, that hinted at an inner world the rest of them couldn't see. The France Joan was born into was fractured. The English occupied large parts of the country, and their Burgundian allies controlled even more. The French crown, such as it was, rested uneasily with the Dauphin Charles, the uncrowned heir who struggled to rally his people and reclaim his kingdom. Most villagers probably assumed this was just the way life would be, that the war would continue until they were old, that kings and nobles would decide their fates from far away, and that the common folk would keep trying to survive in the cracks. But Joan's life would not stay within those cracks. Even as a child, she seemed to be waiting for something, watching, listening, standing quietly on the edge of the fields with her sheep, as if she could hear more than just the wind. And before long, she would claim that she did. In Domrémy, the seasons shaped life as much as the war did. Winter was a time of quiet labor indoors, mending clothes, tending the fire, storing what food they could for the lean months ahead. Spring brought planting and muddy roads. Summer meant long days in the fields, sweat dripping under the sun, with evenings spent on the church steps, cooling off in the last light. And autumn was for harvest, the final push before the year's cold closed in again. Joan's days followed that rhythm. She was no noble woman, no court-bred child with silk ribbons in her hair. She was a peasant's daughter, barefoot when she could be, practical and sturdy, with hands calloused from chores most modern people could barely imagine. She carried water from the well, milked goats, gathered firewood, and learned to bake the coarse brown bread that kept families fed. It wasn't romantic work, it was survival. But survival in Domrémy wasn't just about bread and wood. It was about faith. Faith was woven into everything. Before meals, a prayer. Before work, a blessing. Before bed, a sign of the cross traced in the air. It wasn't an obligation, it was life's anchor in a world that felt forever unsteady. Joan was particularly devout. Her mother, Isabel, taught her not just the basic prayers, but also the deeper rhythms of the church's calendar, the great feasts, the days of fasting, the saints to be honored in each month. By the time she was a teenager, she knew the Mass by heart. She was said to run errands for the priest, light candles before the altar, and join in the village processions with a kind of quiet, almost solemn joy. This devotion set her apart. Even as a child, people noticed how seriously she took these things. Some said she seemed older than her years. Others thought she was simply unusually pious. Whatever it was, Joan moved through her small world as if she was listening to something others could not hear. But she also lived with the realities of her time. When soldiers passed nearby, families whispered in fear. Sometimes the Burgundians raided, taking livestock, burning homes. Other times, villagers would hear news of English victories far to the west. Every adult knew someone who had been killed or had gone missing in the chaos. And though Joan was young, she could not help but feel the unease that clung to the air. It is said that she had a compassionate streak even then. If she saw someone in need, she would give what she could: food, cloth, a helping hand in the field. She seemed to notice the lonely and the wounded more than most children did. And she worked hard enough that her family relied on her even as a young teenager. But the deeper truth is this: Joan's world was preparing her. The rhythm of work taught her endurance. Faith gave her unshakable purpose. The war taught her the price of inaction. She did not yet know it, but soon all these threads would weave together into something no one in Domrémy could have imagined. The girl who fetched water, tended sheep, and prayed by candlelight would one day lead armies. And it would begin not with a sword or a crown, but with a voice. Domrémy may have been small, but it was not untouched by the wider world. News traveled here the way it always did in the 15th century, on the lips of merchants, wandering friars, and soldiers who had reason to pass through. Some news was hopeful: a victory far away, a noble's wedding, a feast day to be observed. But more often it was grim. Whispers of skirmishes in nearby villages, rumors of raids just across the river, stories of homes burned, livestock taken, fields trampled under the boots of armies that never lingered long enough to repair what they destroyed. And then there were the strangers. Sometimes soldiers, their armor battered, their banners unfamiliar. Sometimes desperate travelers seeking shelter, bringing with them the haunted eyes of those who had seen too much. Each visitor carried a piece of the war with them, and each piece added to the quiet unease in Domrémy. Joan grew up with these stories, hearing them the way other children might hear tales of far-off lands. Except in her world, these tales were not just stories. They could be tomorrow's reality. Her family, like most in the village, kept what little they had close. Grain stored high in the loft, salted meat sealed tight, coins hidden where only her father knew. When danger came, and it did, the people of Domrémy knew how to move quickly, vanishing into the countryside with what they could carry. Joan watched all this, absorbing it in the way children do. She learned to read the signs, the sudden tension in the voices of the elders, the hurried way tools were put away, the long silences of the evening meal when news was bad. Still, life was not only fear. There was music in Domrémy too. On feast days, the villagers gathered in the square, musicians playing lutes and fiddles while people danced in wide, easy steps. There were harvest festivals, weddings, baptisms, the kind of celebrations that reminded people they were more than just survivors. Joan joined in as any young girl would. She laughed with friends, listened to old stories, and learned the simple dances of her village. But she never forgot that the world beyond Domrémy was harsher. And she never forgot that the war could steal even these small joys away. It was in these years, half shadowed by conflict, half lit by the warmth of her village, that Joan's sense of purpose began to grow. She could not yet name it, could not yet see its shape, but it was there, waiting quietly beneath the surface of her ordinary life. Soon, the war's shadow would lengthen, and when it touched Domrémy again, it would call Joan out of the life she had always known, and into a path no one could have imagined for her. There are moments in every life when the world seems to hold its breath. For Joan, those moments came in the stillness of her village, in the pauses between the work and the worry, between the celebrations and the storms. She had no way of knowing how short those quiet days would be, but she could feel something, a sense that the world beyond Domrémy was shifting. It was subtle, a tightening in the air, the occasional furrowed brow among the elders, a change in the tone of voices when riders passed through. The war had always been a shadow, but lately it seemed to stretch longer, darker, reaching even into the safe corners of her small world. Sometimes she would linger at the edge of the fields after the sheep were gathered in. The horizon would fade into a violet dusk, the sky melting into black, and she would stand watching the road that wound away from the village. There was mystery in that road. It could bring strangers news, danger, or opportunity. Joan wondered what it might bring to her. She had never traveled far, never seen the great cities of France, but she carried within her a restless spark she did not fully understand. Her faith, already deep, became something more in these quiet years. The saints she'd prayed to no longer felt like distant figures in painted glass windows. They were present, not in sight, but in spirit. She spoke to them as though they were listening. She prayed for her family, for her neighbors, for France itself, and perhaps, though she would not have dared to voice it aloud, she prayed for a purpose, a sign that she could do more than just survive. Life in Domrémy moved in cycles. The seasons dictated the work, planting, tending, harvesting, enduring winter. Evenings were for gathering by the hearth. The fire's glow would flicker across the faces of her family as they mended clothes, sharpened tools, and shared the small stories of their day. Sometimes her father would speak of the land. Sometimes her mother would tell stories of the saints. And sometimes, when news was scarce, they would sit in silence, listening to the wind outside the door. Joan listened always, not just to the words, but to what lay beneath them, the hope, the worry, the unspoken dreams. She carried these moments with her, storing them like seeds in the soil of her heart. There were feast days and weddings, too, moments of joy that stood out like candles in the dark. The village would come alive with music and dancing, and for a night, the worries of war could be forgotten. Joan would join in, smiling, moving to the rhythm, but somewhere in her eyes there remained that faraway look, as though part of her was elsewhere, already listening for something. That something would come sooner than anyone expected. It would not arrive as a thunderclap or a trumpet's call. It would arrive as a voice, soft at first, but certain. A voice that would speak to her in the fields. A voice that would tell her she had a mission unlike any she had ever imagined. The girl who had tended sheep, carried water, and knelt in prayer would soon be called to lead armies, to face kings, and to stand unshaken in the face of death. The quiet of Domrémy was ending. The call was coming. And Joan, though she did not yet know it, was ready to answer. It began in the fields, not in a church, not during a feast day, not even in the stillness of midnight prayer. It began in the open air, under the sun, among the soft bleating of sheep and the rustle of the wind through the grass. Joan was about 13 when it happened for the first time. She had been tending the animals as she always did, watching for strays, keeping them away from the hedgerows, scanning the tree line for wolves that sometimes came too close. It was work she knew by heart, a rhythm of movement and listening, movement and listening. The air that day was warm, but not stifling. The sky was a soft wash of pale light, with shadows drifting lazily across the meadow. The familiar sense of earth and grass rose up around her. Everything was as it had always been, until it wasn't. A stillness settled over the field, not the ordinary quiet of a calm day, but something deeper. The wind seemed to pause. The birds stopped their chatter. Even the sheep, as if sensing something unseen, went still. And in that strange, heavy silence, Joan heard it. A voice, clear, gentle, nearer than her own heartbeat. It was unlike any voice she had ever known. It was not the low rumble of her father, nor the soft tone of her mother, nor the chanting voice of the village priest. It was something else, steady, unshaken, carrying a weight she could feel in her chest. The words themselves, she would later struggle to explain them, but they carried both kindness and command, like a parent who comforts and instructs at once. She felt no fear, only a sense that something greater than herself had turned its gaze toward her. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the voice was gone. The wind stirred again. The birds began to sing. The sheep wandered on as though nothing had happened. Joan stood rooted in place, heart quickened, but mind strangely calm. Had she imagined it? Had the warmth of the day made her drowsy? Or had something truly reached out to her? She did not speak of it, not yet. Some things are too fragile to share the moment they happen. She carried it home with her, tucked deep inside, and that night, when she knelt in prayer before sleep, she thought of it again. Days passed. The voice did not return. Life continued as before, tending animals, fetching water, helping in the kitchen. But Joan's thoughts often drifted to that meadow, that moment, that voice. And then, one afternoon, it came again. She had wandered a little farther than usual, toward the edge of the meadow where a small grove of trees grew. Sunlight filtered through the branches, scattering patterns of gold and shadow across the ground. And in that dappled light, the stillness returned, the same deep quiet, the same sense that the air itself was holding its breath. The voice spoke once more. This time, Joan felt it more than heard it, as if it resonated in her bones. It spoke of faith. It spoke of strength. It spoke of something to come, a task that would require more of her than she could yet understand. She listened. She tried to remember every word, but the meaning was more important than the language. It was as though the voice had opened a door she had not known was there. This time, when it faded, Joan knelt in the grass. She did not know why. It was not fear. It was not even awe. It was simply the only thing that felt right. She whispered a prayer, not a formal one, not the kind she had been taught by rote, but one that rose unbidden from somewhere deeper. She thanked God for the voice. She asked what it meant. She asked what she was supposed to do. No answer came, at least not in words, but Joan felt a peace in her heart unlike any she had known. The voice returned again and again in the weeks that followed, always in the open air, always with that same deep quiet that seemed to pause the world around her. And each time it spoke with greater clarity, not only of faith, but of action, not only of trust, but of courage. It told her that she was chosen for a task for France, a task that would lead her far from Domrémy, far from the sheep and the fields, far into the heart of the war that had shadowed her whole life. It did not yet tell her the full shape of that task, but Joan knew enough to understand that her life was no longer her own. Something had claimed it, something higher. She began to pray more often, slipping away to quiet places where she could be alone. She kept the voices to herself, but her family began to notice a change in her, a certain stillness in her eyes, a focus that went beyond the ordinary devotion she had always shown. The meadow had become her chapel, the sky her cathedral, and the voice her calling. The voice did not stay alone for long. At first, Joan had thought it was just a single presence, a guiding whisper from God, unshaped and without form. But as the days passed and the visits grew more frequent, the voice began to change. It was joined by others. They came to her in moments of stillness, when the work in the fields slowed, when she lingered at the edge of the meadow, when her thoughts sank into quiet prayer. One afternoon, as she stood near the grove at the far boundary of the village land, the air seemed to thicken again, that same strange stillness that had marked the first time, but now it was different. The light itself seemed to shift. The shadows deepened, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the world became other. In that silence, she saw them, not as mortals, no flesh, no faces, but as figures shaped of light. One shone with a pale violet radiance, almost transparent, like sunlight passing through stained glass. Another glowed warmer, like the edge of a candle flame, but without heat. And a third was darker, not threatening, but solid, grounded, its form holding the others in balance. They did not move their lips, yet she heard them as clearly as if they had been speaking aloud. They told her they were messengers, servants of God, saints sent to guide her. They spoke of courage, of faith, and of a task that would soon be hers. Joan did not question them at first. Her heart told her these were no dreams, no trick of the mind, no wandering fancy. These were holy visitations, real and purposeful. But the saints did not hand her a map. They did not tell her the whole plan. They spoke in pieces like threads waiting to be woven. You must be steadfast. You will have work to do. France needs you. Sometimes they would say her name with such care that it felt like a blessing. Other times their tone carried urgency, pressing her to prepare. For what? They did not say. She began to spend more time alone, returning to the meadow and the grove as if drawn by an invisible thread. The villagers noticed, but said nothing. Perhaps they thought she was simply more devout than most. Perhaps they knew she was different and didn't want to disturb whatever was blooming within her. The visits were not always the same. Sometimes the voices came without visions, only the warmth in her chest, the feeling of being watched over. Other times the figures appeared so vividly that she could have reached out and touched them, though she dared not try. They spoke to her of the suffering of France, of the land torn by war, the people weary and divided, the crown unsteady on the head of its heir, and they told her she would have a part to play in healing it. It was a task far beyond the scope of a village girl who had never traveled farther than the next town. Yet she felt no disbelief. Somehow she already knew it to be true. She began to keep their words close, like treasures hidden in her heart. She told no one, not her parents, not the priest, not her friends. How could she explain it? Who would believe her? She barely understood it herself, but she felt herself changing. Her prayers deepened. Her will grew stronger. And somewhere in the quiet of her soul, she began to say yes, even before she knew the full measure of what she was agreeing to. For Joan of Arc, the voices were no passing fancy. They were the first notes in a symphony that would carry her from the fields of Domrémy to the heart of France's greatest battles. And the messengers of heaven were not finished speaking. The visits became part of her life. Days of ordinary work in the fields, evenings by the hearth, nights of quiet prayer, and somewhere between those hours the voices would come. Sometimes they brought light with them, a glow that wrapped around her like a warm cloak. Other times they arrived in darkness, speaking only into her thoughts, their words clearer than the toll of the church bell. And slowly the pieces began to fit together. The voices spoke of France, not the France of her small village, not the rolling hills and quiet lanes she knew, but a greater France torn and bleeding from the long war with England. They told her that the people were weary, the armies weakened, the crown uncertain, that the Dauphin Charles had yet to be crowned king, that his cause hung by a thread. Joan listened, her hands still working the wool, still carrying buckets of water, but her mind fixed on their words. She was told that France needed help, that God had chosen her to give it. It was impossible. She was a peasant girl. She had never held a sword, never seen a battlefield. She could not even ride a horse with the ease of a soldier. And yet the voices spoke without doubt, and she found none in herself. They told her she would lead, not in her own name, but in God's. She would drive the English from France. She would see the Dauphin crowned in the great cathedral at Reims. She asked them how she, the miller's daughter, could stand in the place of knights and lords. They answered that it was not her strength that mattered, but her faith, that armies could be raised, banners could be made, armor could be forged, but courage and obedience to God could not be fashioned by any smith's hand. That was the gift she had. They gave her signs, not for others to see, but for her to understand. A flicker of violet light in the dark of the grove, the shape of a cross in the bent grass after a windless night, the unshakable calm that would descend upon her after their visits. And yet, with the calling came weight. Joan felt the burden of their words pressing on her, heavy and constant. She was only a girl, but she knew, truly knew, that she could not refuse. To turn away would be to deny the God who made her. At times she tried to imagine what it would be like to stand before Charles to speak to him of her mission. Would he believe her? Would he laugh? Would his court drive her out before she even reached him? But the voices reassured her. You will go, they told her. You will be heard. You will be given what you need. In her quiet moments, Joan began to prepare herself. She prayed longer, speaking aloud to the saints, as though they were standing in the room. She learned more of the saints' lives from the village priest. She asked the blacksmith about armor, not for herself, but as though curious about the work. She studied the road beyond Domrémy, tracing in her mind the path she would have to take. She knew the day would come when she could no longer keep the voices to herself. The time for hiding them was ending. The mission was becoming too urgent, the call too strong. The saints had told her France would be saved, the Dauphin would be crowned, and she, Joan, would lead the way. And in her heart, she had already said yes. By now, the voices were no longer rare visitors. They had become her constant companions. Whether she was in the meadow by the well or kneeling in the cool shadows of the church, she could feel them near, as if heaven itself had placed a hand on her shoulder and refused to let go. The saints spoke with greater urgency, no longer only words of comfort or faith, but instructions. They told her plainly she must go to the Dauphin, Charles, heir to the throne of France. She must tell him that God wished him crowned, and she must lead his armies to victory against the English. It was no longer a distant idea or a dream to ponder at night. It was a command, and Joan, though still a girl of barely 16, knew she could not refuse. Her mind raced with questions. How would she leave Domrémy? How would she convince her parents? How would she even be allowed into the presence of the Dauphin? But the voices gave her no answers, only the certainty that she must go. Joan was no stranger to hard work, but this would be different. This was not the labor of sowing seeds or tending flocks. This was the labor of faith, and it would cost her everything familiar. At night, she lay awake in the quiet of her small room, listening to the sound of the wind through the shutters. She imagined the road stretching away from her home, winding through forests and fields to places she had never seen. She imagined the faces of soldiers, the banners of war, the gleam of armor in the sun. And she imagined standing before Charles himself, speaking the words the saints had placed in her heart. It seemed impossible, and yet no part of her doubted it would happen. Her parents noticed her growing restlessness. Her mother found her praying more than ever, her eyes distant as though she were listening to something far away. Her father, practical and cautious, wondered aloud if she was troubled. But Joan kept her secret. It was not yet time to reveal what she knew. The saints told her the time was near. The message was clear. Act now or the chance will be lost. They warned her of the suffering ahead, of the trials she would endure, of the enemies she would face. And yet, they spoke with a steady assurance that she would not be alone. Joan began to prepare in quiet ways. She listened to travelers for news of the roads. She studied the paths on old maps when she could. She asked small questions about the nearest towns, the castles, the lords. And in the secrecy of her heart, she practiced the words she would say to the Dauphin. The meadow had been her chapel, the voices her teachers, and faith her armor. Now she was ready to step beyond the safety of her village and into the vast uncertainty of the world. Her journey would begin soon. The decision had been made, and Joan of Arc would never be the same. It began quietly. No trumpet, no farewell feast, no crowd to watch her go. Just Joan, a girl of 16, setting her feet on the road that would carry her far from the only home she had ever known. For months, the voices had been telling her the same thing. She must go to the Dauphin. She must tell him that God had chosen her to lead France to victory and to see him crowned at Reims. The words had burned in her mind like an unquenchable flame. She could no longer ignore them. She knew it would not be easy. Her parents were not likely to agree. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a man of the land, cautious, steady, wary of danger. He believed that the world beyond Domrémy was too dangerous for a girl, especially in times like these. And he was right. The war between England and France had left the countryside crawling with mercenaries, brigands, and soldiers with no loyalty except to themselves. So Joan kept her preparations quiet. She asked questions in passing, never too directly. She learned from travelers about the roads and river crossings. She remembered every direction given, every landmark described. The map was forming in her mind. The voices reassured her, "You will not be alone. You will be given help. You will find the way." But she would need more than faith to reach Chinon, where the Dauphin waited. She would need to convince someone to take her there. That someone was her uncle, Durand Laxart. He lived in the nearby village of Bury-le-Petit and was a man of good reputation, respected, dependable, known to be sympathetic to the French cause. Joan decided to go to him first. One winter morning she set out from Domrémy, her breath curling in the cold air, the earth hard beneath her boots. She wore nothing unusual, a wool dress, a cloak against the wind, sturdy shoes for the road. She carried no sword, no armor, no sign of the destiny she claimed was hers, only the certainty in her heart. The walk to Bury-le-Petit took hours, the road winding past frost-covered fields and bare-branched orchards. Joan kept her hood low, watching the thin plume of her breath drift into the pale winter sky. It was a lonely walk, but she felt no fear. The voices had told her this was the way. When she reached her uncle's home, she asked to speak with him alone. And there, in the small warmth of his kitchen, she told him her secret. She spoke of the voices of the saints, of the message they had given her. She told him she must go to Charles at Chinon, that God himself had commanded it. Durand listened carefully. Whether he believed her completely or not, Joan could not tell. But he did not laugh, and he did not turn her away. Instead, he asked her questions about the voices, about what they had told her, about why she thought the Dauphin would listen. And Joan answered simply, directly, without hesitation. In the end, he agreed to help her. He would take her to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, where Robert de Baudricourt, the local garrison commander, held authority. If she could convince Baudricourt to support her, she might gain an escort to Chinon. This was only the first step, but it was a beginning. The road to Vaucouleurs was longer and more treacherous than the walk to her uncle's home. The countryside was restless. There were rumors of Burgundian patrols in the area, and the fields were empty more often than they were worked. But Joan's determination carried her forward. Durand walked beside her, speaking little. She could tell he was still weighing her words, deciding if her mission was divine or simply impossible. When they reached Vaucouleurs, Joan's courage was tested. Robert de Baudricourt was no easy man to impress. A seasoned soldier, blunt and practical, he was not given to entertain the visions of peasant girls. Joan stood before him, her cloak still dusted from the road, her eyes clear and unwavering. She told him who she was, what the voices had said, and what she had come to do. Baudricourt listened, then shook his head. He told her to go home. France had armies enough, commanders enough, troubles enough without the addition of a young girl claiming divine command. It was a refusal, a wall placed directly in her path. Most people would have turned back, but Joan did not. She simply bowed, thanked him, and left. The voices had not told her to turn back, and so she would not. She returned to her uncle's home in Bury-le-Petit, undiscouraged. She would try again, and again, until the wall gave way. In the days that followed, Joan prayed more than ever. She asked for strength, for courage, for the right words when she next stood before Baudricourt. She did not know it yet, but her persistence would soon bear fruit. The commander who had turned her away would one day send her to Chinon with an armed escort. But for now, the road was still before her, and Joan, shepherdess, peasant, chosen, was walking it step by step. The days after her first meeting with Robert de Baudricourt were cold and still. Frost rimmed the edges of rooftops. The fields lay empty beneath the pale sky. The air felt suspended, as though winter itself was holding its breath. But Joan was not still. She moved between her uncle's home and the small chapel in the village, her thoughts circling the same truth. The voices had not told her to turn back. She would try again. Her uncle, Durand Laxart, was patient but concerned. He had seen her stand before Baudricourt once already and be sent away. Most people, he told her, would have taken that as the end of the matter. But Joan was not most people. The voices had told her to go to the Dauphin, not to try, not to consider it, but to go. That left no room for surrender. She began to visit the small parish church more often, kneeling in the dim light before the altar. The stone floor was cold against her knees, but she barely felt it. Her prayers were not the murmured repetitions of daily devotion. They were conversations, quiet but intense, with the saints who had spoken to her. She asked for patience, for strength, for the words that would pierce the wall of disbelief standing between her and Chinon. Some days she walked alone through the bare winter fields, following the narrow paths where the frost crunched under her boots. She would pause, close her eyes, and listen, not for the sound of the wind or the birds, but for the silence that came before the voices. Sometimes they came, sometimes they did not, but even in their absence, she felt watched over, guided. Durand eventually agreed to help her try again. If nothing else, he reasoned, her determination was so strong that denying her might do more harm than good. And so once more they set out for Vaucouleurs. The road was as they had left it, winding between leafless trees, crossing frozen streams, passing hamlets where smoke rose in thin plumes from chimneys. They saw few travelers. The countryside was uneasy. The war had left many unwilling to linger on the open road. When they reached Vaucouleurs, the mood in the garrison was much the same. Soldiers moved briskly, their boots striking the stone with sharp, echoing steps. The walls of the fortress loomed gray and unwelcoming in the winter light. Baudricourt was no warmer. When Joan stood before him a second time, she found him just as blunt as before. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Send a peasant girl to the Dauphin so she can tell him she's sent by God?" The question was rhetorical. He was not expecting or wanting an answer, but Joan gave him one anyway. "Yes," she said simply, Her voice did not rise, her gaze did not waver. She told him again what the voices had said, that Charles must be crowned, that France must be freed, that God had chosen her to help make it so. If he was moved, he did not show it. Again, he told her to go home, but this time she noticed something different. Though his words were the same, there was no laughter behind them. He was not mocking her. He was dismissing her because he could not yet see what she saw. Joan left the garrison as determined as she had entered, and now others were beginning to notice her persistence. A few villagers in Vaucouleurs had heard whispers of the girl who claimed to speak with saints. Some dismissed her as fanciful, but others began to wonder. It was in those days that Joan began to speak more openly about her mission. Not to everyone, never recklessly, but to those she sensed might listen without scorn. She told them she sought to lead an army to lift the siege of Orléans. She spoke of the Dauphin's rightful crown. She spoke of God's will for France. The voices urged her not to fear disbelief. Faith, they reminded her, did not wait for proof. And so Joan waited in Vaucouleurs. She stayed with friends and allies, moving quietly through the town, returning often to the chapel for prayer. The winter passed slowly, but time, like water, has a way of wearing down even the hardest stone. Baudricourt, perhaps weary of her persistence, perhaps moved by the stirrings of belief, began to shift. He did not yet grant her an escort, but neither did he order her away, and in that small change Joan sensed that the tide was turning. In the evenings she would walk to the edge of the town walls and look out over the darkened hills. Somewhere beyond them lay Chinon, the Dauphin, the moment for which she had been chosen. She could not yet touch it, but it was coming closer. One night, standing in the cold air with the stars faint above her, she whispered aloud to the voices, "I will go, even if I must walk the whole way alone. Even if no one believes me until the day comes." The words carried away into the darkness, and with them the quiet certainty that she was not speaking into emptiness. The mission was alive, and Joan was still walking toward it. The winter had deepened by the time Joan returned to Vaucouleurs for the third time. Snow lay in uneven drifts along the roads, half melted in places where the sun touched them, frozen hard in the shadow of the walls. The Meuse River moved sluggishly under its thin cover of ice, whispering softly against the banks. The journey itself was not so different from before. The same winding paths, the same villages huddled against the cold, the same endless horizon where fields met sky. But something had changed, not in the land, in Joan herself. She was no longer simply a girl with a message from heaven. She was a girl who had been tested and had not turned back. Each refusal had only sharpened her resolve. And now, whispers of her mission had begun to travel faster than she could. By the time she reached the gates of Vaucouleurs, there were people waiting, not a crowd, but enough to notice. Curious faces peered from doorways. A few soldiers nodded to her, not mockingly, but with a flicker of respect. They knew who she was. They had heard that she had stood before Baudricourt not once, but twice, and that she had not been sent packing in disgrace. That alone was enough to make some of them wonder. She stayed again with friendly families who believed, or at least hoped, that her mission was real. They gave her a place by the hearth, bread and stew to warm her, and the quiet space she needed for prayer. And in those quiet hours, Joan spoke to the voices as if they sat across from her at the table. It was during these days that her supporters began to grow. Men of the town, hearing her speak, began to say aloud what they had only thought in secret, that France was in need of something or someone extraordinary, that perhaps God really had sent this young woman. Joan did not flatter them with promises. She told them plainly, "It is not I who will save France. It is God. I am only his servant." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Even the most skeptical listener could not deny her conviction. Still, Baudricourt remained unconvinced. When she stood before him a third time, he asked her the same question he had before. "What makes you think the Dauphin will believe you?" Joan answered as she always did, "Because it is God's will." She spoke without fear, without pause. And for the first time, Baudricourt did not immediately send her away. Instead, he regarded her for a long moment. Perhaps he was measuring the certainty in her eyes. Perhaps he was considering the growing murmur in the streets. Perhaps he was wondering if, just maybe, the hand of God was in this after all. Whatever his thoughts, he gave her no answer that day. But Joan sensed that something within him was shifting, that the stone wall she had been pushing against was beginning to give. The change became clearer over the following weeks. Baudricourt began to allow her to remain in Vaucouleurs without interference. He did not summon her often, but when he did, his questions were no longer dismissive. He asked about the voices, about the saints, about what they had told her of France's future. Joan answered each question plainly, without embellishment, but with an unshakable steadiness that seemed to root her more deeply in the room each time she spoke. Her presence began to draw men of higher standing. Messengers, minor nobles, and even seasoned soldiers came to see the girl who claimed a mission from heaven. Some came to scoff, but left unsettled by her certainty. Others came out of curiosity and left with a quiet sense that perhaps they had just stood in the presence of something holy. The voices, too, seemed to speak with more urgency. They told her that the moment was coming, that soon she would leave Vaucouleurs behind, that the Dauphin's hour was drawing near. Joan prepared as best she could. She gathered information about the road to Chinon. She asked which towns were safe, which bridges were guarded, which rivers ran deep this time of year. She listened to the accounts of soldiers who had traveled that way, memorizing every detail. But more than anything, she prayed, not for herself, but for France, for Charles, for the countless nameless people whose lives had been crushed beneath the weight of the war. Her faith was not abstract. It was a living thing, and it grew stronger with each passing day. It was in this growing atmosphere of anticipation that the first serious offer of help came. A small group of men in the town, tradesmen, soldiers, and even one minor noble, approached her quietly. They told her they believed. They told her they wanted to help her reach Chinon. It was not yet official. Baudricourt had given no word, but Joan could feel the current changing direction. The road that had seemed barred at every turn was beginning to open. One evening, standing at the edge of the town walls, as she had done so many times before, Joan looked out over the dark winter landscape. Snow covered the hills in soft folds, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Somewhere beyond them, Chinon waited, and with it the Dauphin and the mission for which she had been chosen. She whispered a prayer into the cold air, not for herself, not for victory, but for the strength to walk whatever road God placed before her. And as she stood there, the voices seemed to answer, not in words, but in the same deep, steady assurance they had always given her. The turning tide had begun. By late winter, Vaucouleurs had grown used to her presence. The girl from Domrémy who claimed to hear voices was no longer a stranger on the streets. She was a fixture. People spoke of her in the marketplace. They whispered her name in the taverns. Some still doubted, of course, but the number of those who quietly believed was growing. Joan moved through the town with a quiet purpose. She had no fine clothes, no banner, no armor, nothing to suggest the role she claimed God had given her. But wherever she went, her eyes carried the same steady certainty, as though she could see a road invisible to everyone else. The voices had told her again and again, "You will go to the Dauphin." And now, at last, the way was beginning to clear. Robert de Baudricourt had resisted for months. He had told her to go home. He had called her mission unnecessary. But lately, he had begun to listen more closely. Reports from the war were grim. France was losing ground, morale was low, and the Dauphin's cause seemed desperate. Perhaps that desperation made him more willing to consider the possibility, however unlikely, that this girl might be part of the answer. It was not a sudden change. No single conversation unlocked his support. Rather, it was the slow wearing away of doubt, chipped at by Joan's unshakable persistence. In the end, it was not just her words that convinced him. It was the growing murmur of the people. The merchants who spoke of her conviction. The soldiers who said she had the bearing of a commander. The townsfolk who swore they saw a kind of light in her presence. Baudricourt was not a man easily swayed by mysticism, but he was a soldier, and soldiers learn to recognize resolve when they see it. And Joan's resolve was unlike anything he had encountered. When he finally called her before him again, the air in the garrison felt different. The usual hardness in his tone was tempered by curiosity. He asked her one last time to tell him what she believed God had called her to do. Joan did not hesitate. Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of every prayer she had ever spoken. "I am to go to the Dauphin, to lead his armies, and to see him crowned king at Reims. This is God's will." There was no plea in her words, no bargaining, only the statement of a truth as she knew it. Baudricourt studied her in silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. And then, slowly, he nodded. "You will go," he said. It was not just permission, it was a command. And with it came the promise of an armed escort to take her safely through the dangerous, war-torn countryside to Chinon. The news spread quickly. The girl from Domrémy, the one they had whispered about all winter, was leaving. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled knowingly, as if they had always expected this day to come. Joan spent her last days in Vaucouleurs making quiet preparations. Friends helped her gather what she would need: sturdy clothes for travel, provisions for the road, and the small, humble cross she always kept close. There was no armor yet, no banner, those would come later. For now she would go as she had lived, simply, plainly, with faith as her shield. The voices spoke to her often in those final nights. They did not warn her away from the road ahead. They encouraged her toward it. They told her she would face hardship, that the journey would be long and dangerous, but that she would not walk it alone. On the morning of her departure, the sky was pale and cold. The streets of the coolers were lined with a few onlookers, not a grand farewell, but a quiet, steady acknowledgement. Some offered blessings, some crossed themselves, some simply watched in silence. Joan mounted a horse provided for her journey. The leather creaked under her weight, the breath of the animal rising in white plumes into the crisp air. She looked once more at the town that had tested her so fiercely. It had been her proving ground, the place where she had learned that God's calling was not easily granted, but earned through persistence. With a final nod to Baudry Court, she turned toward the road. The escort rode ahead, their armor catching the faint light of the winter sun. Behind them, the town began to fade into the distance. Each step of the horse carried her farther from the safety of the familiar and closer to the heart of her mission. She did not know exactly what awaited her at Chinon. She did not know if the Dauphin would believe her or if the court would laugh her away, but she knew one thing. She was going where God had sent her. The gate of the coolers closed behind her, and the sound of it echoed like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The road stretched ahead, long and uncertain, but she did not falter. For Joan of Arc, the gate had opened, and the journey to Chinon had truly begun. The air was sharp with the bite of late winter as Joan's horse carried her away from the gates of the coolers. The pale sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the frozen road. The breath of the horses rose in faint clouds, dissipating into the chill morning air. Her escort was small, a handful of men on horseback, chosen for their loyalty and skill. They were soldiers, but not the kind who rode in glittering formation. Their armor was worn, their cloaks patched from years of hard use. Each carried a weapon, but more importantly, each carried the unspoken understanding that the road ahead would be neither safe nor simple. Joan rode near the middle of the group. Her cloak was pulled tightly around her shoulders, the hood drawn low over her face to keep out the wind. In her hand, she clutched the small wooden cross she had brought from home. It was smooth from years of touch, a comfort against the uncertainties that stretched before her. The road wound between fields that lay barren and silent under the pale light. Once, these lands had been alive with the sound of plows and the call of farmers to their teams of oxen. Now, the war had stripped them bare. The cottages stood with shutters closed, chimneys cold. Occasionally, a wisp of smoke rose from a far-off roof, proof that someone still held to the stubborn rhythm of survival. They rode in silence for long stretches. The only sounds were the steady beat of hooves on frozen ground and the soft jingle of bridles. Joan did not mind the quiet. It gave her time to pray, to speak inwardly to the voices that had guided her this far. She asked for safe passage, for courage, for the strength to speak when her moment before the Dauphin came. The men who rode with her cast occasional glances in her direction. Some were curious, some were skeptical. All of them knew they were part of something unusual, even if they didn't yet understand it. They had heard the rumors that this young woman claimed to have been sent by God, that she would lead France to victory, that she would see the Dauphin crowned. But rumors are easily dismissed until you ride beside the one at their center. As the hours passed, the road narrowed, threading between clusters of leafless trees. The shadows there were deeper, the air colder. They crossed a small stone bridge over a stream that murmured quietly under a crust of ice. The water moved slowly, as though reluctant to leave the shelter of its banks. By midday, they reached the first small village on their route. It was little more than a scattering of houses around a central square. The people watched from doorways as the group rode in, their expressions wary. Travelers were not always welcome in these times. Soldiers, even less so. Joan kept her head bowed, not from shame, but from a quiet awareness that these people owed her nothing. If they knew who she was, they gave no sign. One older woman crossed herself as they passed. A child clung to her skirts, peeking out with wide eyes. They stopped briefly at the well to water the horses. The cold bit at Joan's fingers as she held the reins, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were on the road ahead, on Chinon, on the Dauphin, on the mission that had carried her out of her home and into this uncertain path. They did not linger in the village. The afternoon light was already beginning to fade, and the leader of her escort knew better than to be caught on the open road after nightfall. Bandits were a danger even in quiet times. In war, they were bolder still. As they rode on, the land began to rise and fall in gentle hills. The road curved with the contours of the land, sometimes vanishing into small wooded valleys before climbing again to open ridges. From one such ridge, Joan could see far to the west. The fields rolled away into a soft haze, broken here and there by the winding silver of rivers and the dark lines of distant woods. The sight filled her with a quiet resolve. This was the land she had been called to protect, not just the fields and villages, but the people who lived in them, who endured despite the hardship, who waited for hope. She felt the voices near her then, as if they too were looking out over the winter countryside. They did not speak in words. They didn't need to. The day was drawing to a close when they came upon a small wayside chapel. It stood alone at the edge of a copse of trees, its stone walls weathered but sturdy. A simple wooden cross rose above the roof line, catching the last light of the sun. The leader of her escort suggested they stop for the night. There was no inn here, no place to take shelter other than the chapel and the small lean-to beside it. But it was enough. The horses were tied and given feed. The men gathered around a small fire just outside the chapel door. Joan slipped inside. The air within was still and cold, scented faintly with beeswax from the candles that had burned there. The altar was simple, adorned with a rough carving of the Virgin and Child. She knelt before it, clasping her cross in her hands. Her prayer was long and unhurried. She prayed for the men who rode with her, for the villages they would pass, for the Dauphin she had yet to meet, and for the strength to be faithful to the task God had given her, no matter the cost. When she finally rose, the last light of day had faded from the windows. She stepped outside to find the fire burning low, the men wrapped in their cloaks, speaking in low voices. The cold pressed in around them, but above, the stars had begun to emerge, countless points of silver scattered across the dark sky. Joan looked up at them for a long moment. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills and rivers and the reach of her sight, was Chinon, and with every step she took, she was drawing nearer. Tomorrow the road would lead them deeper into the heart of France, and she would ride it as she had ridden every mile since leaving home, with her face set forward, her faith unshaken, and the voices close at hand. The next morning, frost still clung to the edges of the chapel roof as the small company prepared to ride. The horses snorted softly, their breath curling into the cold air like thin threads of smoke. The men moved with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had spent too many mornings breaking camp in the open. Joan mounted her horse without a word. The voices had been quiet through the night, but she felt their presence nonetheless, like a warm current beneath the cold surface of her thoughts. She knew they would speak when the moment came. The road stretched ahead, a pale ribbon winding between the sleeping fields. They rode in a loose column, the leader scanning the way ahead, two men riding behind to guard the rear. Every few miles they passed the husks of villages, clusters of stone houses with collapsed roofs, doorways yawning dark and empty. Sometimes the ruins were silent. Other times they carried faint signs of life, a thin curl of smoke from a chimney, a lone figure moving behind a broken wall. But these figures did not wave or call out. They simply watched as the company passed, their eyes unreadable. The war had taught people caution. Too many times the arrival of armed men, whether friend or foe, had meant loss rather than help. Joan felt the weight of those stares. She wondered how many of them had lost sons to the fighting. How many had been forced to abandon their homes when the armies swept through? She wondered if they saw her as just another traveler, or if they could somehow sense the mission that carried her onward. By midday, the road began to climb into low hills. The wind was sharper there, pulling at cloaks and carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke. Somewhere ahead, another settlement lay hidden from view. When they crested the ridge, they saw it, a small town gathered along the bend of a frozen river. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful. The rooftops were white with frost, and the water glimmered faintly under the pale sun. But as they drew nearer, the scars of war revealed themselves. A burned-out mill by the water, blackened timbers leaning drunkenly toward the ground. Fields left untended, the earth hardened and empty. The company slowed as they entered the town. Here, the people did not hide behind shutters. They came out into the street, wary but curious. Children peered from behind the skirts of their mothers. A few older men leaned on walking sticks, watching in silence. One of the soldiers in Joan's escort called out a greeting, and a woman answered with a nod. The exchange was brief, but it seemed to ease the tension. A man offered to water the horses, and the company dismounted near the town's central well. Joan used the moment to walk a few paces away toward the small church that stood near the square. The door hung slightly open, the interior dim but warm with the scent of beeswax and old wood. She stepped inside, lowering her hood. The church was humble, no great stained glass, no gilded altar, but its quiet felt like a balm. She knelt at the front, resting her folded hands on the worn wooden rail. Her prayer was simple: strength for the road ahead, protection for her companions, and the courage to face whatever lay between her and Chinon. When she rose to leave, a few of the townspeople were waiting outside. An elderly woman stepped forward and pressed a small bundle into Joan's hands, bread wrapped in cloth. Joan thanked her, meeting her eyes for a brief moment. The woman said nothing, but there was a flicker of something there, recognition, perhaps, or simply hope. They left the town in the fading light. The road narrowed again, running close to the river, before turning into a stretch of woodland. Here the shadows deepened quickly. The bare branches formed a lattice against the pale sky, and the sound of the horses' hooves seemed louder in the stillness. It was in these woods that the company grew more watchful. This was the kind of place where danger could lie unseen. A bend in the road hiding a band of outlaws, a cluster of trees concealing a small Burgundian patrol. But the day passed without incident. The only signs of life were the startled deer that bounded away at the sound of their approach and the distant cry of a lone raven. As night began to gather, they came upon another small wayside shrine, little more than a stone cross set into the earth, with a few weathered candles at its base. The men decided to make camp nearby. The firelight flickered against the trunks of the trees, casting tall, swaying shadows. The smell of smoke and damp earth mingled in the cold air. Joan sat slightly apart from the others, her hands clasped around her wooden cross. The voices were still quiet, but in her heart she felt their steady reassurance. The road ahead was long, but she was no longer a girl waiting for permission. She was a girl on her way to fulfill a command. In the darkness beyond the firelight, the river moved unseen, carrying the winter current toward places she had yet to reach. And somewhere far ahead, beyond hills and forests and the last stubborn edge of winter, the Dauphin of France was waiting. The third day on the road began under a sky heavy with low clouds. The light was gray and thin, casting a muted pall over the frozen fields. The air smelled faintly of smoke, not from their own campfire, but from somewhere beyond the horizon. The soldiers in Joan's escort noticed it too. They rode on without speaking for some time. In the winter stillness, sound carried far, and each creak of saddle leather, each jingle of harness felt loud against the hush. Joan kept her gaze forward, her hood drawn low, but her thoughts were sharp. The voices had been silent since the previous night. She knew better than to take that as abandonment. Silence was not absence, it was waiting. By mid-morning, they passed another small hamlet. Unlike the previous towns, this one was clearly abandoned. The windows were empty hollows, the doors hanging crooked on their hinges. A barn stood half collapsed under the weight of the winter snow. No footprints marked the frost in the main path. The place had been empty for some time. One of the men muttered that Burgundian troops had likely passed through weeks earlier, clearing out what little remained. Others suspected bandits had driven the people away. No one could say for sure, but the effect was the same, a hollowed-out ghost of a village, another casualty of the long war. Joan felt the ache of it in her chest. Each empty doorway was a reminder of why she was riding toward Chinon at all. This was the cost of a fractured France. Not just lost battles, but lost homes, lost lives, lost hope. They did not linger there. The road bent away from the ruins, leading into a shallow valley. The wind was gentler here, but the air was colder. Frost clung stubbornly to the shaded hollows, and the river beside them moved slow and dark. It was there, in the valley, that they first saw signs of others on the road. Fresh tracks cut into the mud where the frost had melted. More than one set, perhaps half a dozen men on foot. The leader of her escort frowned, glancing at the shadows along the tree line. They rode on more carefully after that. The men kept their hands close to their weapons, their eyes moving constantly from the road to the woods and back again. Joan felt their tension, but she did not share it in the same way. She was cautious, yes, but she also felt the quiet certainty that her journey would continue as the voices had promised. Still, the road was a place of risk. They slowed when the path narrowed between two low ridges, moving in tighter formation until the ground opened again into broad fields. There, a gust of wind caught Joan's hood and pushed it back slightly. One of the soldiers glanced her way and for a moment simply looked at her, as if reminded that the figure in the cloak was not another rider like himself, but the girl they had heard so much about. By afternoon, they reached a point where the road forked. One branch turned south toward a larger town where they might find food and shelter. The other cut west, a more direct route toward Chinon, but with fewer settlements. They chose the southern road. The weather was turning, and there were signs of more snow in the air. Better to rest, gather supplies, and ride fresh than risk being caught in the open with little to eat. The town appeared in the distance near sunset, a cluster of rooftops rising from the frost-white fields, smoke curling from a handful of chimneys. Here, life was still holding on. The people watched the companies approach, but did not hide from it. A few even raised hands in greeting. The leader of her escort arranged lodging in a small, low-ceilinged inn near the town square. The smell of firewood and cooking stew met them at the door, a welcome change from the damp cold of the road. Joan removed her cloak, the heat of the room loosening the tension in her shoulders. They ate simply bread, broth, a bit of cheese, and spoke little. The fire in the hearth burned low, sending a warm orange light across the room. Joan sat quietly, her cross resting in her palm, her eyes half closed in thought. Tomorrow they would ride again. The road would lead them farther from the safety of familiar lands and deeper into the uncertainty that waited between her and Chinon. But the path was set, and she would follow it until it brought her to the Dauphin himself. The snow came in the night, not in a blinding storm, but in a steady, quiet fall that blanketed the town's rooftops and softened the edges of the streets. When Joan and her escort stepped out of the inn at first light, the air was crisp and still, the sky a pale wash of silver above them. The horses' hooves left dark impressions in the fresh snow as they made their way back to the road. The men pulled their cloaks tighter, their breath clouding in the cold. Joan rode with her hood drawn up, the cross warm against her palm inside her glove. They passed through the last houses of the town and back into open country. The fields lay untouched, the snow lying smooth and unbroken, except for the winding track ahead. A lone crow cut across the pale sky, its call sharp in the stillness. As they traveled, the road began to climb again. From the higher ground, they could see far across the winter landscape, lines of dark forest, silver ribbons of frozen streams, the faint smudge of other villages in the distance. Somewhere beyond those ridges was Chinon. The voices were with her that morning. They spoke not in visions, but in the quiet certainty she had come to know so well. They told her she was drawing near, that the Dauphin was waiting, though he did not yet know it. By midday, they reached a stretch of road that ran through a dense stand of trees. Here the snow was deeper, clinging to the branches above, falling in soft showers whenever the wind stirred. The company rode in single file, their path narrowing between the trunks. The sound of the horses was muffled, the world wrapped in white silence. It was in such places that the dangers of the road felt most real. The leader kept his eyes moving, scanning the undergrowth and the bends in the path. War had left France's roads as dangerous as any battlefield, not always from soldiers, but from the desperate and the lawless who lived in its shadows. But no danger showed itself that day. Only the stillness of winter, the muted sound of hooves in snow, and the steady rhythm of travel. By afternoon, the trees gave way again to open land. They stopped briefly at a roadside shrine, a small stone figure half buried in snow, its features worn smooth by years of weather. One of the men cleared the snow from its base, revealing a simple carving of the cross. Joan dismounted and knelt before it. Her prayer was brief, but in her heart it was deep, a quiet offering for strength, for guidance, and for the moment soon to come when she would stand before the Dauphin. As they rode on, the signs of larger settlements began to appear. The road widened, the snow marked by more tracks, carts, wagons, other riders. Smoke rose from chimneys in the distance. They were leaving the emptier, harsher stretches of countryside and moving into lands where the Dauphin's influence was stronger. That evening, they reached a market town larger than any they had passed since leaving Vaucouleurs. The square was busy despite the cold, traders packing away their goods, townspeople crossing the square with baskets, the sound of voices rising into the winter air. Here, her presence drew less curiosity. Travelers came and went often. Another small company of riders was nothing unusual, and yet Joan could feel herself on the threshold of something. Every mile they covered now was a mile closer to the heart of her mission. They found lodging for the night in a sturdy inn overlooking the square. The rooms were warmer than any they had known in days, the fire in the common room burning bright. The smell of stew and fresh bread drifted through the air. Joan sat quietly by the fire, the flicker of its light casting shadows across her face. She thought of the road behind her, the villages scarred by war, the empty hamlets, the cold nights under the stars. And she thought of the road ahead, leading straight to Chinon, to the Dauphin, to the moment the voices had promised her from the beginning. Tomorrow they would ride again, and soon she would pass through the gates of the place where her destiny would meet its first great test. The last leg of the journey carried Joan and her escort through lands unlike the ones they had left behind. Here the villages were busier, the fields better tended, the roads more worn by travel. The weight of the long war still hung over them, but the sense of abandonment was less. There was life here, cautious but alive. The morning was clear, the air sharp with the scent of wood smoke from unseen chimneys. The winter sun was pale but steady, throwing long shadows across the road. Joan rode in silence, her gaze fixed ahead. She had been on the road for many days, each step bringing her closer to the moment the voices had promised. The first glimpse of Chinon came in the afternoon. From the crest of a hill, she saw it in the distance, the dark line of the river cutting across the land, and beyond it, the stone towers of the chateau rising above the town. The walls caught the pale light, a gray crown set upon the ridge. For a long moment, she simply looked. This was the place she had been riding toward since she left Domrémy, the place where her path and the Dauphin's would meet. The voices had spoken of it often, not in detail, but with the quiet certainty that this was where she must go. The road wound down toward the river, passing through smaller hamlets on its way. Here, the people were used to travelers. They glanced at the riders, but did not linger. Merchants carried goods toward the town. Carts rolled slowly along the muddy tracks, and the smoke of cook fires curled into the cold air. By the time they reached the riverbank, the sun was sinking toward the horizon. The water moved in slow ripples, reflecting the pale sky. The bridge that crossed it was guarded. Men in the Dauphin's colors stood watch, their spears gleaming faintly in the fading light. The leader of her escort rode forward, speaking quietly with the guards. Joan waited, her horse shifting beneath her. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips, not from fear, but from the nearness of what she had been called to do. The guards studied her openly, their eyes moving from her face to the small wooden cross in her hands. They exchanged a few words, then stepped aside to let them pass. The bridge carried them into the heart of Chinon. The streets within the walls were narrow, lined with timber-framed houses whose upper stories leaned over the road. Shops and taverns spilled warm light onto the cobblestones, their doorways crowded with people. The sound of voices, of horses, of the city's constant movement filled the air. It was overwhelming after so many days on the quiet winter roads. But Joan took it in calmly, her eyes moving over the faces, the signs, the patterns of life here. They climbed steadily toward the chateau, the road curling upward through the old part of town. From the windows above, people leaned out to watch the small company pass. Some called down questions, others simply stared. At last, they came to the gates. The great doors stood open, torchlight spilling onto the stone. Beyond lay the courtyard, and somewhere within those walls, the Dauphin himself. They were met by the garrison, the clatter of armor echoing in the cold air. Names were given, messages passed, and after a brief exchange, Joan was told she would be lodged within the chateau until she could be received by the Dauphin. It was not yet the moment she had come for. The audience would come in its own time, but she was here, inside the walls, close enough to feel the nearness of what lay ahead. That night, as she lay in the small chamber given to her, the sounds of the castle carried faintly through the stone, footsteps on the stairs, voices in the hall, the creak of old timbers settling. Joan closed her eyes and let the stillness settle over her. The voices had been right. She had come to Chinon, and soon she would stand before the Dauphin. The first morning within the walls of Chinon felt different from any Joan had known. The air inside the chateau was warmer than the road. It carried the weight of stone, cool in the corners, still in the halls. From her narrow window, she could see the rooftops of the town spilling down toward the river, the winter light soft against the water. She rose early, habit, perhaps from her years in Domrémy, where each day began with work before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Here, the rhythm was different. The chateau stirred slowly, its great corridors waking with the shuffle of servants, the measured steps of guards on their rounds, the faint murmur of voices behind heavy doors. Her escort had been given quarters elsewhere in the castle. She was alone in her chamber, save for the small wooden cross on the table beside her bed. She touched it briefly before kneeling at the foot of the bed to pray. The voices were quiet, but their absence did not trouble her. She had learned to trust that they spoke when they must, and were silent when it was enough for her simply to wait. The waiting was not easy. Her arrival had been announced, but the Dauphin's court was a world of its own, ruled by schedules, protocols, and the slow turning of decisions. She was not yet summoned. In the days that followed, she walked the inner courtyards, the cold stone under her boots echoing her steps. She watched the garrison drilling in the yard, swords striking against shields, the dull thud of pikes meeting the ground. The air was thick with the smell of oiled leather and wood smoke. At meals in the great hall, she sat at the long trestle tables with others who served or visited the court. Some were curious, asking careful questions about her journey, her mission, the reason for her presence. Others merely watched in silence, perhaps weighing whether she was truly what she claimed to be. There were rumors in the air, always rumors, of the siege of Orléans, of shifting alliances, of the Dauphin's uncertain future. France seemed balanced on the thin edge of a blade. It was not hard to imagine that the court might hesitate before giving much weight to the words of a young woman from a distant village. Still, Joan's presence was not without effect. The story of the girl who had ridden through winter with a handful of soldiers, saying God had sent her to lead France, traveled quickly through the corridors. She heard whispers behind her as she passed, not all flattering, but not all dismissive either. On the third evening, a messenger came to her chamber. She was to remain prepared. The Dauphin intended to receive her soon, though the day and hour had not yet been set. She nodded, thanking him quietly, and closed the door behind him. The message was simple, but it was enough. The door to her purpose was opening. That night, she found herself restless. She sat by the narrow window, watching the torches flicker along the outer walls. The town below was a scatter of warm lights against the dark. Somewhere beyond the river, the land stretched away toward the fighting, the war she had come here to help end. She thought of the saints, of the voices, of the command that had brought her here. It was almost within reach now, yet she knew that the first meeting would be only the beginning. There would be tests. There would be questions. There would be those who tried to turn her away, but she also knew she would not be swayed. She had not come this far to falter at the threshold. The following day, the castle seemed busier. The corridors hummed with movement, the sound of boots, and the rustle of fine clothing. She caught glimpses of courtiers moving in small groups, their voices low, their faces turned inward toward private matters. It was easy to feel invisible in such a place, and yet she sensed eyes on her at times, weighing her, perhaps even measuring her against the rumors that had reached them before she did. Late in the afternoon, she went to the chapel within the chateau. It was larger than the village churches she had known, its vaulted ceiling arching high above, its stone walls cold but clean. Candles burned in clusters before the altar, their light soft against the carved wood and stone. She knelt there for a long time, her hands resting on the cross she carried. She prayed not for an easy audience, but for a true one, for the Dauphin to see her not as others described her, but as she was, the servant of the God who had called her here. When she left the chapel, the winter sky outside the windows was deepening into night. The torches were being lit again along the walls, their flames bowing and flaring in the evening wind. And somewhere within the chateau, the Dauphin was making his own preparations. Soon they would meet, and the course of Joan's life, and perhaps the life of France, would shift forever. The summons came at last. It was late afternoon when the messenger arrived at her chamber, his voice low but clear. "The Dauphin will receive you." Joan rose at once. She had known the moment was near, but the sound of those words set her heart beating in a steady, deep rhythm. She touched the small wooden cross that never left her side, drawing it briefly to her lips before slipping it back into her hand. The messenger led her through the chateau's winding corridors. The air was cool and faintly scented with burning wood from the great hearths. Her steps echoed softly against the worn stone, mingling with the muted voices and the far-off murmur of the great hall ahead. As they approached, the sound of the court grew clearer, the rustle of fine garments, the low hum of conversation, the shuffle of boots on the polished floor. The great doors stood open, torchlight spilling into the hall in a warm, golden haze. But Joan knew this meeting would not be simple. The Dauphin had chosen to test her. Somewhere among the gathered courtiers, he would stand disguised as one of his own men, while another, richly dressed, would take his place. It was a game meant to reveal whether she was truly sent by God, or simply a girl carried by her own imagination. The escort paused at the threshold, and for a moment Joan stood looking into the vast chamber. The vaulted ceiling rose high above, banners in the Dauphin's colors draped between the stone arches. Dozens of faces turned toward her, their expressions a mix of curiosity, doubt, and guarded expectation. She stepped forward. The sound of her boots against the floor seemed to ring louder than it should have. Her gaze moved across the assembled court, not quickly, not searching, but as if she were simply looking for something she already knew she would find. Then she saw him. Not the man who stood in the place of honor, wearing fine robes and a jeweled chain, but the man half hidden among the courtiers, dressed plainly, watching her with careful eyes. She walked past the false Dauphin without hesitation, crossing the hall toward the one the voices had shown her. Her steps did not falter, and when she reached him, she sank to one knee. "My Lord Dauphin," she said simply, "God has sent me to you." A ripple went through the hall, soft but unmistakable. The courtiers shifted, their whispers threading through the air like wind in the high rafters. The Dauphin himself looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, quietly, he asked her to rise. They spoke together for a time apart from the crowd, their voices low. What words passed between them, only the two of them knew. Some said she told him of a secret prayer he had made to God, one he had shared with no one. Others believed she spoke of things to come, of victories yet unseen. Whatever she said, it was enough. The Dauphin's face softened, and the guarded weight in his eyes seemed to lift. When they returned to the company of the court, there was something different in the way he looked at her, not as a stranger to be tested, but as one whose place at his side was no longer in question. The formalities ended soon after, but the air in the hall had shifted. Those who had doubted now looked at her with new interest, though still with caution. Those who had believed from the start stood a little taller. That night, Joan was given better lodging within the chateau, warmer chambers, more comfortable than any she had known on the road. It was a sign that the Dauphin meant to keep her near. But Joan knew that the audience was only the beginning. The voices had not sent her here to win the favor of a court. They had sent her here to take up the work that would follow, to gather an army to lift the siege of Orléans, and to see the Dauphin crowned in Reims. She sat by the small fire in her new room, the crackle of the flames soft in the quiet. Outside the window, the dark pressed close against the glass, the river far below glimmering faintly under the moon. Somewhere in the chateau, the Dauphin moved through his own thoughts, considering what lay ahead. Joan closed her eyes and prayed, not for herself, but for the strength to carry the task she had been given. And as she prayed, she felt the quiet presence of the voices once more, steady, sure, unyielding. The first step had been taken, and there would be no turning back. In the days after that first audience, Joan's place in the chateau was quietly, but unmistakably, altered. She was no longer the unknown girl from the gates. She was now a figure of interest, a subject of whispers in the corridors, of speculation in the great hall, of cautious conversation among the Dauphin's closest advisors. Not all welcomed her presence. Some in the court saw her as a curiosity, a passing novelty to be indulged for a time before being set aside. Others, wary of anything that could disrupt the fragile balance of politics, regarded her as a potential danger. And yet, there were those fewer in number but stronger in voice who felt she had been sent for a reason. The Dauphin himself was among them. He began to seek her counsel in private, speaking with her in the smaller chambers away from the constant noise of the court. She did not press him with grand promises or demands. Instead, she spoke plainly of what she believed God intended, that he should take his rightful crown, that France should be free of its enemies, that the siege of Orléans must be broken. The Dauphin listened, sometimes in silence, sometimes with careful questions. She could see that he was a man carrying the heavy weight of uncertainty. War had drained France's strength, and many had begun to wonder if victory was still possible. But when she spoke, something in him seemed to steady, as though the sheer force of her conviction lent him a little of her own certainty. It was not enough to win a war, but it was enough to begin. One cold evening, Joan stood in the upper courtyard, looking out over the town of Chinon below. The river caught the last pale light of day, winding silver through the dark land. She thought of the road to Orléans, of the soldiers already there, holding the lines against the English, of the townsfolk trapped inside the siege walls. The voices had spoken often of Orléans. It was there that her mission would truly be tested. The Dauphin knew this as well, and so the question began to take shape between them. Not if she would go, but when and with whom. For that, she would need the court's acceptance, or at least enough of it to move forward. So she met with the Dauphin's captains, the men who would command under her. Some were skeptical. They measured her with the eyes of soldiers, weighing her against the hard realities of battle. She met their gaze without flinching, speaking not of tactics, but of purpose, the kind of purpose that can make men fight harder than steel or coin ever could. Word of these meetings spread. In the taverns outside the castle walls and the side corridors of the court, people began to speak of the girl who might lead them to Orléans. There were doubts, of course, but also a stirring of something rarer, a cautious hope. The Dauphin began to act on that hope. He ordered that Joan be provided with proper armor and a banner, not as an ornament, but as the visible sign of her command. She was to be treated not as a messenger, but as one who would ride at the head of his forces. When she first saw the white field of her banner, bearing the sacred names and symbols she had chosen, she traced her fingers lightly over the fabric. It was more than cloth. It was a declaration. Preparations for the journey to Orléans began quietly but steadily. Men were chosen for the escort, supplies gathered, the routes discussed in guarded voices. The winter cold still held the land, but already the air in the chateau seemed to carry a different current, one moving toward action. Joan knew the path ahead would be dangerous. The road to Orléans would cross through lands still contested, past towns where English banners flew, past places where allies were uncertain and enemies bold. But the voices had never wavered. They told her this was the way, that the Dauphin's fate and the fate of France would turn there. One evening, as the fire in her chamber burned low, she knelt before the small cross she carried. Her prayer was long and quiet, her words for God alone. When she rose, the weight in her heart felt lighter, replaced by the same steady certainty that had carried her from Domrémy to Chinon. The Dauphin had begun to trust her. The captains were beginning to follow her, and soon all of France would know her name. The morning she left Chinon was cold but clear. The castle rose behind her in pale winter light, its stone walls catching the low sun, its towers crowned with a haze of chimney smoke. The town below was stirring, shopkeepers unlatching shutters, carts creaking onto the streets, the river glinting faintly as it wound past the edge of the city. In the courtyard, horses stood ready, their breath rising in white clouds, the soft clink of harnesses cutting through the stillness. The Dauphin's captains moved among the men, giving quiet orders, checking straps, tightening buckles. There was no fanfare, no shouted farewell. The work of war seldom allowed for ceremony. Joan stepped out from the arched doorway, the white field of her new banner folded under her arm. She wore the armor that had been fitted for her in the days before, light enough for movement, strong enough for the road ahead. It was not gilded, not ornate. It was the armor of one who would ride and fight, not simply be seen. The men turned to look as she approached. Some still held doubt in their eyes. Others watched her with a quiet respect they would not yet name aloud. Either way, she had their attention. The Dauphin himself was not riding with her. He would remain in Chinon, his court and council still bound to the duties of the crown. But he came to the courtyard to see her off. He spoke with her briefly, words too low for the others to hear. She answered with the same calm conviction she had carried since the first moment they met. When he stepped back, she mounted her horse in one smooth motion, her banner now unfurled. Its white cloth caught the pale light, the sacred names embroidered upon it, standing out in deep color. The breeze caught its edge, sending it rippling like a living thing. The signal to move came with no trumpet, no drum, only the forward motion of the lead riders, the slow creak of saddles, the steady beat of hooves on the frozen ground. They wound their way down through the narrow streets of Chinon, past rows of timber-framed houses, past the market stalls where merchants paused to watch them go. Children stood at doorways, craning to see the white banner as it passed. Some crossed themselves, some simply stared. At the edge of the town, the road opened into the countryside. The air felt different there, wider, emptier, filled with the muted sounds of winter fields. The ground was still hard with frost, the sky pale and unbroken. The road ahead bent toward the east, carrying them toward the Loire and the siege that waited at its banks. For a time the company rode in near silence. The rhythm of travel was steady, the landscape shifting slowly, fields giving way to low hills, hills to sparse woodland, woodland back to open ground. A few scattered farmsteads stood along the way, their smoke curling straight into the still air. The men rode in loose formation, their eyes on the road and the ridges beyond. Even in these safer lands, caution was second nature. The war had a way of leaving danger in unexpected places. Joan kept her banner high, her gaze forward. The voices had not spoken since dawn, but she felt their nearness all the same. A quiet, steady presence riding beside her. She knew where she was going. She knew why she was going. And that was enough. By midday, they crossed a small bridge over a slow-moving stream. The water was dark under its thin skin of ice, the banks lined with bare willows whose branches trailed like hair into the current. The sound of hooves on the wooden planks echoed faintly in the cold air. They stopped briefly on the far side, letting the horses drink where the ice had been broken away. Joan dismounted, walking a short distance to where the willows leaned over the water. She stood there for a moment, looking down at the faint reflection of the banner in the stream. The world beyond the surface seemed strange and inverted, the banner upside down, the sky darker than it truly was. For just an instant, she thought of all that might lie ahead. Battle, loss, victory, sacrifice. Then she turned back to the road. The journey to Orléans had begun. It would carry them through towns where allies waited, past places where the English held the ground, across rivers that marked the line between friend and foe. Every mile would take them deeper into the heart of the war. When they set out again, the wind picked up, tugging at cloaks and banners. The white cloth snapped sharply in the air, the sound like a flag on a ship's mast cutting through a stiff breeze. It carried with it a sense of movement, not just of the riders along the road, but of something larger, something already in motion before they had even left the gates of Chinon. Somewhere ahead, Orléans waited, a city surrounded, holding out against the siege. And Joan rode toward it not as a visitor or a messenger, but as one who intended to lift the shadow that had fallen over its walls. The road stretched long before her, and she met it without fear. The farther they rode from Chinon, the more the land began to change. The roads were narrower now, worn into deep ruts by carts and hoof prints. The hedgerows that lined the way were untrimmed, their tangled branches reaching like black fingers into the pale winter sky. In these lands the war was never far. The fields lay half fallow, some scarred by old trenches, others dotted with the weathered frames of siege engines left to rot. Farmhouses were fewer, and those that still stood were guarded by high fences and cautious eyes watching from the windows. The air itself seemed to carry a different weight, quieter, but with a tension beneath the stillness. Every sound carried, the snort of a horse, the clink of armor, the faint creak of leather. The men and Joan's escort rode more closely together here, their hands never far from their weapons. By midday, they passed through the remains of a village. The roofs had been burned away, the timbers collapsed inward. Charred beams jutted at odd angles from the frozen earth. A lone well stood in the center, its rope frayed, its bucket gone. They did not stop. There was nothing here for them but the echo of what had been lost. Even Joan, who so often paused to speak to villagers along the road, kept her gaze forward, the white of her banner stark against the gray sky. The voices were silent, but she felt them near. It was as though they too were watching, not to guide her step by step, but to see how she would move through this quiet, dangerous country. They rode on into the low hills, the road climbing in gentle slopes before dipping again into hollows where the frost clung stubbornly to the ground. The wind shifted here, carrying with it a faint smell of wood smoke. Whether it was from a hearth or a burned ruin, no one could say. Late in the afternoon, the lead rider raised a hand, slowing the column. Ahead, a small hamlet came into view. Half a dozen cottages clustered along the road, their thatched roofs patched with winter frost. Figures stood in the narrow lane, watching. Some were old men leaning on staves. Others were women holding small children close. They did not wave. They did not smile. They simply watched as the riders approached. Joan rode forward, lowering her banner slightly in greeting. One of the women stepped closer, her expression wary but curious. Her eyes lingered on the banner, then moved to Joan's face. For a moment, something softened there, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps the smallest spark of hope. Joan asked gently about the road ahead. The woman told her in few words. The English had been seen not far from here, moving between the river crossings. The lanes were not safe after nightfall. It was wise to keep moving. Joan thanked her, and the company pressed on. The warning sat in the minds of the riders like a quiet weight. The winter light was already thinning. The long shadows of the hedges reached across the road. They rode faster now, their breath rising in quick bursts, the sound of hooves steady but urgent. Somewhere behind them, a crow called, its voice sharp in the still air. By the time they reached the edge of the next ridge, the sun had slipped low, the sky deepening toward twilight. Below, the land opened into a flat expanse of fields and marshy ground, the road cutting straight across it like a dark thread. Far to the east, faint against the dimming light, there was movement, small shapes crossing the open land. It was impossible to say at this distance whether they were friend or foe. The captain of the escort studied them for a long moment before urging the company onward. Best to put distance between themselves and whatever shadows moved on the plain. The first stars were appearing by the time they reached a ruined chapel by the roadside. Its roof had long since fallen in, but the walls still stood, offering some shelter from the wind. They decided to camp there for the night. The horses were tethered close to the sheltering wall, their tack loosened, their breath steaming in the cold. A small fire was kindled in the lee of the stone, its glow flickering against the broken doorway. Joan sat apart for a time, her hands folded over her cross. The voices came then, not loud, not urgent, but with a calm strength. "Do not fear what moves in the distance," they seemed to say. "You will pass through." She breathed in the cold air, letting the words settle in her chest like a steady flame. The night closed in around the camp, the road stretching away into darkness. Tomorrow they would ride again, deeper still into the lands where the war lived, and each step would bring them closer to Orléans. Dawn came slowly, spilling pale light over the frost-crusted ground. The fire in the ruined chapel had burned low, leaving only faint threads of smoke curling into the air. The men moved quietly, the sound of leather straps being tightened and buckles fastened, echoing against the stone walls. They rode out before the sun had fully risen, their breath misting in the still air. The road ahead was narrow and flanked by low marshland, its reeds swaying faintly in the cold wind. Here there was no shelter, no hedgerows to hide behind, no walls to shield them from view. The captain kept the company close, his eyes scanning the open land. They were entering ground where English patrols had been sighted more than once. The knowledge pressed on them like a silent weight. Even the horses seemed to feel it, their ears twitching at the smallest sound. Joan rode near the center, her banner furled and bound against the wind. It was not the moment for display. The white cloth lay still, the sacred names hidden from sight until the road was safer. The first sign of movement came near mid-morning. On the far side of the marsh, a small group of riders appeared, their figures blurred by distance, but moving steadily along a track that curved toward the road. It was impossible to tell whose colors they bore. The captain raised a hand, slowing the company. They waited, motionless, save for the quiet shifting of the horses. The riders on the far side moved on, their shapes fading into the low mist that clung to the marsh. Only when they were gone from sight did the company move forward again. The road wound between patches of frost-hardened earth and shallow pools where the ice cracked under the horses' weight. Every splash, every snap of frozen grass seemed louder than it should have been. The stillness of the air carried each sound far across the open ground. By midday, the land began to rise. Low ridges broke the flatness, dotted with skeletal trees that clung to the winter soil. The road narrowed again between two such ridges, the slopes on either side littered with the blackened remains of old campfires. It was here that they saw the second sign of danger, a plume of smoke, faint but unmistakable, rising from beyond the crest ahead. The captain called a halt. Voices were hushed, gestures kept small. The company gathered close, deciding whether to turn back or press on. Joan spoke then, her voice steady but low. "We will pass through," she said. The certainty in her tone was quiet but unyielding, like a stone set deep in the earth. She did not offer promises of safety. She did not dismiss the danger. She simply spoke as one who already knew the road ahead would open for them. The decision was made to ride on. They moved in a tighter formation, the sound of the horses muffled by the frozen ground. As they crested the ridge, the source of the smoke came into view, a small encampment, its tents weathered and its fires low. Figures moved between them, but they were too far to call out. Whether they were English or simply another band of soldiers moving through these lands, no one could say. The company kept their pace steady, not rushing, not slowing. They'd passed without challenge, the camp fading behind them as the road dipped again toward the river. The tension began to ease only when the water came into view. A narrow bridge spanned the slow-moving current, its planks rimed with frost. Crossing it would take them out of the open marshland and into the low woods beyond, a place with cover and more than one path forward. They crossed in silence, the sound of hooves on wood echoing softly over the water. On the far bank, the air felt different, heavier, but safer somehow. The trees stood bare above them, their branches arching like the ribs of some great cathedral. They rode until the sun dipped low, the light slanting through the trunks in long, cold beams. At last, they found a clearing near a bend in the river, where the ground was dry enough to make camp. The fire that night burned brighter, its glow pushing back the shadows at the edge of the clearing. The men spoke a little more freely, the tightness in their voices easing with each passing hour. Joan sat apart, her cross resting in her hands, her gaze on the banner now unfurled beside her. The white cloth caught the firelight, its edges stirring in the faint breeze. The voices were silent, but she felt their presence close, a steady watchfulness in the quiet dark. Tomorrow they would ride farther still, past the last uncertain stretches, and toward the gates of Orléans itself. And when they arrived, the banner would fly openly once more. The fourth morning on the river road began under a pale, colorless sky. Mist clung low to the water, curling in slow drifts across the banks. The horses' hooves made a damp rhythm on the soft earth, their breath joining the faint fog in the still air. The company rode in steady formation now. The worst of the open ground was behind them, but they were close enough to Orléans to feel the press of the siege. The land bore its marks, fields trampled into mud, broken wagons left abandoned at the edges of the road, blackened posts where watchfires had once burned. By midday, the sound of distant bells reached them, not in celebration, but in the slow, deliberate tolling that carried across the Loire. It was the city calling its people to the day's work, even under siege. As they rounded a bend in the road, the first sight of Orléans came into view. Its walls rose pale and strong against the winter sky, towers breaking the line where banners hung limp in the cold air. Beyond the walls, faint curls of smoke marked the hearths within, and outside, scattered across the land, stood the English siege works. Their wooden towers and earthen bulwarks crouched low like watchful beasts. The company slowed. Even at a distance, the sight was heavy with meaning. Here was the heart of the struggle, the place the voices had spoken of from the beginning. The captain raised a hand and they rode on, moving carefully now. The white banner was unfurled once more, catching what little breeze moved through the cold air. Its edges rippled softly, the sacred names upon it, clear to any who watched. As they drew nearer, the English lines became more distinct. Clusters of tents, the skeleton frames of siege engines, sentries moving along the edges of the works. The river flowed between the main force and the city's heart, its gray surface broken here and there by narrow bridges and low ferries. Joan's gaze never left the walls. The voices were near now, close enough that their presence seemed to hum in the air around her. This was where they had led her, step by step, through winter roads and silent villages, through the watchful eyes of friend and foe alike. The final approach took them along the riverbank, past a scattering of ruined houses where the stone walls still stood, but the roofs had long since fallen in. A few townsfolk moved among them, gathering what little wood could be pulled from the wreckage. They looked up as the riders passed, their eyes following the white banner. One of the men called out a blessing. Another crossed himself, and Joan, without breaking her gaze from the road ahead, raised her hand in quiet acknowledgement. At last, they reached the point where the gates of Orléans loomed above. The heavy wooden doors stood closed, but watchmen were already leaning from the battlements, calling down to the captain of her escort. There was a brief exchange, the familiar back and forth of recognition and permission, and then the great doors began to open. The sound was deep and deliberate, wood and iron groaning on their hinges. Beyond lay the shadowed passage of the gatehouse, its stone walls close and damp, the air cool within. The hoofbeats of the horses echoed sharply in the confined space, and then they emerged into the city itself. The streets were narrow, paved in uneven stone, lined with houses whose upper stories leaned over the way. Despite the siege, life pulsed here, women carrying baskets from market to home, children darting between doorways, soldiers moving in small groups toward the walls. Everywhere, eyes turned toward the riders, toward the white banner, toward the young woman at its side. Word spread quickly. The girl sent by God had arrived. Men and women came into the streets to see her pass, their faces a mix of disbelief and hope. Some called her name softly, as if unsure they were permitted to speak it aloud. Others simply watched in silence, as though committing the sight to memory. The company made its way toward the heart of the city, where the commanders of the defense would meet them. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and the sharp tongue of the river. Above it all, the sound of hammers striking wood carried from the ramparts, the ceaseless work of strengthening the walls against what pressed outside them. When they reached the central square, Joan dismounted. Her boots met the worn stone with a soft sound. She rested her hand briefly on the banner, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. The journey from Chinon was over. The next chapter, the one for which all the others had prepared her, was about to begin. That night she would sleep within the walls of Orléans, but soon she would ride out again, not as a traveler on a winter road, but as a commander in the field, carrying the hope of a besieged city and the will of God toward the fight. The gates closed behind them with a deep, deliberate thud. The sound lingered in the narrow streets, mingling with the distant hammering on the city's ramparts. Inside the walls, the air felt different, tighter, denser, as though every breath carried the weight of the siege. Joan's horse stepped carefully over the worn cobblestones as she followed her escort toward the city's heart. The white banner trailed beside her, its cloth catching the occasional gust that threaded through the streets. Eyes followed them from doorways, from narrow windows, from shadowed corners where townsfolk paused in their work. This was no curious crowd of bystanders. Here, every look was sharpened by need. The people of Orléans had been living under the siege for months, the enemy close enough to see from the walls. Food was measured carefully. Messages from beyond the lines were rare, dangerous to carry. Hope had become a fragile thing, passed quietly from hand to hand. The company wound its way to the central square where the commanders of the defense waited. Men hardened by long service stood in a loose cluster, their cloaks dusted with frost, their eyes measuring the young woman who approached. Some nodded in greeting, others simply watched, silent and reserved. Joan dismounted smoothly, handing her reins to a soldier. The captain studied her as though trying to reconcile the rumors they had heard with the reality before them. The girl sent by God, the Dauphin's chosen, the one who claimed she would lift the siege. They led her into the town hall, where a long wooden table stood scattered with maps and lists. The air inside was warmer, but heavy with the scent of wax, damp cloth, and wood smoke. Candles burned along the edges, throwing shadows across the marked lines of the enemy's positions. One of the commanders, a man named Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, gestured toward the map. His voice was even, but there was a quiet weariness in it. He spoke of the siege works, the English strongpoints, the river crossings, the stockpiles of supplies. It was the language of men who had been holding the line for far too long. Joan listened closely, her eyes tracing the lines of the Loire, the placement of the enemy forts, the thin arcs of friendly territory still within reach. When Dunois finished, she placed her hand lightly on the table. Her words were simple. "We will drive them back, but we must move soon." There was a flicker of reaction around the table, some approving, others skeptical. The commanders were not men given to rash action. They knew the cost of every failed attempt to break a siege. But Joan's voice carried no hesitation. She spoke as though the decision had already been made in a place beyond maps and measurements. When the meeting ended, she stepped back into the winter streets. The city was alive in its own way, not with celebration, but with the quiet persistence of survival. Children carried small bundles of kindling. Women drew water from the public wells, speaking in low voices. A blacksmith worked in the open air, the rhythmic ringing of his hammer echoing off the stone walls. Joan walked among them, the banner at her side. People paused as she passed. Some inclined their heads, some whispered her name, and slowly the quiet eyes that had measured her with guarded curiosity began to show something else. A light, faint but steady. That night she stayed in a modest room within the city. It was warmer than the winter road, the fire in the hearth steady and low. From the window she could see the rooftops sloping toward the walls, beyond which the dark shapes of the English siege lines waited. Torches burned in the distance, pinpricks of light against the black field. She prayed before sleeping, her hands wrapped around the small wooden cross she had carried from home. The voices were close again, their presence like the warmth of the fire against her face. They spoke of the days ahead, of the need for courage, of the strength that comes when one moves not alone, but with the will of heaven at one's side. Outside, the bells told the slow, measured hour. Orléans slept uneasily within its walls. But for the first time in many weeks, a thread of quiet expectation wound through its narrow streets, the sense that the siege might yet be broken, and that the girl with the white banner might be the one to do it. The morning broke cold and clear. Frost lay in delicate patterns along the rooftops, clinging to the edges of windows and the worn stone of the streets. From the square, Joan could hear the slow toll of the bells calling the city to wakefulness. She stepped out into the crisp air with the white banner at her side. Her boots rang softly on the cobblestones as she made her way toward the walls. The streets were already busy with the work of the siege. Women carrying baskets of bread to the guard posts, blacksmiths stoking their forges, the clatter of wooden wheels as carts rolled toward the storerooms. When Joan reached the base of the walls, she found the soldiers already at their posts. They stood wrapped in thick cloaks against the cold, their armor dulled from long service. Some leaned on the stone battlements, eyes fixed on the land beyond. Others moved slowly along the parapets, their footsteps measured, their gaze scanning the enemy lines. Joan climbed the steps to the rampart walk. The wind caught at her hair as she emerged into the open, the height giving her a clear view of the siege. The English lines sprawled beyond the walls, clusters of wooden towers, earthworks mounded high, palisades bristling with sharpened stakes. Thin trails of smoke rose from their campfires, blurring the edges of the horizon. Between the city and the siege works lay open ground, broken only by the low curves of ditches and the frozen stubble of the winter fields. It was a sight that might have crushed the spirit of those who had looked on it too long. But Joan stood with her chin lifted, her gaze steady. The voices had told her this place would be freed, and she believed them. The soldiers watched her as she moved along the wall. Some nodded in greeting. Others simply stared, their expressions unreadable. They had heard the rumors, the promises, that this girl from the countryside would lead them to victory. They had seen many commanders come and go. Why should this one be different? Joan did not try to persuade them with speeches. Instead, she stopped beside them, asked their names, asked how long they had been on the wall. She listened as they spoke of the long nights, the thin supplies, the way the enemy sometimes shouted insults across the open ground to keep the defenders awake. She told them simply that the siege would end, that the English would be driven back, not with empty bravado, but with the calm weight of someone speaking a truth already set in motion. Her presence traveled quickly along the parapets. Where she stopped, shoulders straightened. Where she passed, men seemed to stand a little taller, as if remembering the purpose that had brought them here in the first place. By midday, she had walked nearly the entire length of the wall. From every vantage point, the enemy lines seemed the same, patient, methodical, waiting for the city's will to falter. But within the walls, something subtle was shifting. Later, she joined the captains again in the town hall. The maps were still spread across the long table, the candles guttering in the cold air. They spoke of small actions, repairing a section of wall damaged in the night, moving supplies closer to the riverside, preparing boats for swift movement under cover of darkness. Joan listened, then urged that these preparations move quickly. She reminded them that the longer they waited, the more the siege would harden around them. Her words did not fall on deaf ears. Even those still skeptical could not ignore the effect she was having on the men. The captains exchanged glances, then gave quiet orders to hasten the work. That evening, Joan returned to the ramparts. The sun was sinking now, turning the low clouds above the enemy lines to muted gold and violet. Torches flared along the walls, their light flickering against the stone. The cold air carried the faint smell of smoke from the siege camp beyond. She stood at the highest point of the wall, the banner lifted in the wind. From below, in the darkening streets, people looked up and saw it. The white cloth caught the fading light, rippling like a flame that would not go out. It was not a battle cry. It was not a command. It was a signal, a quiet promise that the fight to free the city was coming, and that they would not face it alone. The cold dawn rose pale over Orléans, its light creeping slowly down the stone walls and spilling into the narrow streets. The air carried the stillness of a city holding its breath. From the ramparts, the English siege lines were just as they had been the night before, patient, watchful, unmoving. But within the walls, something had shifted. The long passivity of the siege was beginning to break. The talk among the soldiers was no longer only of endurance, but of action. Joan moved quietly through the barracks that morning. Men sat sharpening blades, checking bowstrings, fitting fresh heads to arrows. The scrape of whetstone on steel, the soft creak of leather straps, and the muted murmur of voices blended into a steady rhythm. She stopped beside one group, watching as they worked. They looked up at her briefly, then bent again to their tasks. They knew what she was preparing for, even if no orders had yet been given aloud. By midday, she stood with the captains in a sheltered corner of the wall, the map of the enemy positions spread across a low table. Her hand rested on the section near the river, a weaker point in the English works, where the ground sloped unevenly and the fortifications were less complete. "If we strike here," she said softly, "we can take what they have built, pull it down, and return before they can gather against us." The captains exchanged glances. It was not a full assault, not yet, but a raid to test the enemy's strength and remind the city that the walls were not a prison. They agreed. The plan would be set in motion before sunset. When the hour came, a small force gathered at one of the postern gates, the narrow doors built for swift movement in and out of the city. Joan rode at their head, the banner furled for now, her armor gleaming faintly in the low light. The gate opened just wide enough to let them pass, the iron hinges groaning softly in the cold air. The moment they were outside, the open ground seemed vast and exposed. The silence pressed in on them, broken only by the muffled thud of hooves and the crunch of boots in the frozen soil. The walls of Orléans rose behind them. Ahead, the enemy works loomed closer with each step. The first sight of movement came near the half-finished fort. A handful of English sentries paced along the low wall, their figures small against the flat horizon. They had not yet seen the riders. Joan raised her hand, and the company quickened their pace. The sound of their approach drew the sentry's attention. A sudden shout, the ring of steel, the call for reinforcements. The French riders struck swiftly. Ladders were pulled down the outer palisade breach. The wooden frames of the siege engines set alight. The fire caught quickly, its orange glow sharp against the pale afternoon sky. Joan rode into the heart of the fort, her voice clear over the din. Take what you can, burn the rest. The men moved with practiced speed. Supplies were seized, ropes cut, beams pushed over until the timbers crashed into the frozen earth. The flames leapt higher, sending coils of black smoke drifting toward the enemy camp. By the time the English began to gather in force, Joan's company was already withdrawing toward the city. The banner was unfurled now, its white field bright against the dark smoke behind them. The sight carried back to the walls, where the defenders raised their voices in a cheer that rolled along the ramparts. The postern gate swung open, and the raiding party slipped back inside. The heavy door closed with a solid thud, sealing them once more within the city. The soldiers laughed quietly as they dismounted, the heat of action still in their faces. It had not been a great battle, but it was a beginning, proof that the siege was not an unbroken chain, that the English lines could be struck and shaken. That evening, the fire from the ruined fort still burned beyond the walls, its glow visible in the dark fields. Joan stood on the ramparts, watching it. She could see the English moving in the distance, shadows flitting between the light and dark. The voices were near her then, steady and sure. This is only the first stone. The wall will fall. She breathed in the cold night air, letting the words root themselves deep in her heart. Tomorrow and the days after, there would be more to do, larger strikes, harder blows. But tonight, the people of Orléans would sleep knowing that the siege could be touched, and that their hope had begun to move beyond the walls. The raid of the previous day had left a mark. From the ramparts, the blackened timbers of the ruined fort still lay smoldering in the cold morning air. The English had worked through the night to clear the wreckage, their silhouettes moving like shadows against the pale light. Inside Orléans, the mood was different. The defenders moved with more purpose now, their steps quicker, their voices carrying a new energy. It was as if the single act of stepping beyond the gates had loosened a knot that had been tightening for months. Joan walked the streets early, her banner folded under her arm. Men greeted her with nods. Women offered quiet blessings as she passed. The small victory had traveled quickly through the city, and with it, the belief that more could be done. By midday, she was again with the captains at the long table in the town hall. The maps were spread wide, the candles flickering in the draft from the half-open shutters. She pointed to another section of the siege, a strong point guarding one of the key approaches to the city. It was more heavily fortified than the last, but striking it would send a greater shock through the English lines. The captains exchanged glances, weighing the risk. It was bold, perhaps too bold, but the window for action was open, and hesitation would only let the enemy tighten their grip. They agreed. The strike would come before the day's end. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the chosen force gathered at the main gate. The cold air carried the smell of smoke from the siege lines, a faint reminder of the fire that still lingered beyond the walls. Joan rode at the head, the banner unfurled this time, its white field catching what little light remained. The gate swung open, and they moved out as one. The ground between city and enemy was open, but they crossed it with steady purpose. The English sentries shouted warnings. The sound of alarm bells carried faintly across the frozen air. The clash came quickly. French soldiers surged against the outer palisade, axes biting into the wooden stakes. Arrows hissed through the air, some striking the ground with dull thuds, others glancing off armor. Joan rode close to the front, calling for the men to press harder, her voice cutting through the noise. The barrier gave way, and the defenders of Orléans poured through. Inside the fort, the fighting was sharp but brief, the English caught off guard by the speed of the assault. Once again, siege engines were set ablaze, their wooden arms collapsing in showers of sparks. Barrels of supplies were overturned, ropes cut, earthworks pulled down by determined hands. The fire leapt high in the fading light, sending thick, black smoke curling upward. It was a signal the whole city could see, a sign that another link in the siege had been broken. The English began to rally in the distance, their shouts growing louder as more men moved toward the fight. Joan gave the order to withdraw. The French fell back in good order, the banner streaming behind them as they crossed the open ground once more. The gates of Orléans yawned wide to receive them, closing firmly after the last rider passed inside. The noise of the enemy's shouts faded into the winter air, replaced by the echo of boots and hooves on the stone streets. This time, the cheer that rose within the walls was louder, carrying through the narrow streets and up to the rooftops. Men clasped hands. Women embraced their children. For the second time in as many days, the city had struck at the siege and returned stronger than before. That night, Joan stood on the highest part of the ramparts. The fires from the destroyed fort still burned in the distance, their glow reflected faintly on the surface of the river. Beyond them, the dark shapes of the remaining siege works stood against the cold sky, silent for now, but watchful. The voices came again, close and certain. You have begun the breaking. Continue, and the chain will fall. Joan gripped the shaft of her banner, feeling the truth in those words. The siege was no longer only a trial of endurance. It was a fight now, one that would move beyond the walls, one that would carry them toward victory. The morning after the second raid broke with a strange stillness. From the walls of Orléans, the English siege works lay quiet. No hammering of timbers, no shouts carrying across the cold air. Only the slow, drifting smoke from their watchfires marked their presence. The men on the ramparts spoke of it in low voices. Perhaps the enemy was repairing the damage from the night before. Perhaps they were simply waiting. But to Joan, the stillness felt like a pause before a storm, the kind that comes when both sides know the next move will decide the course of the fight. Inside the city, the change was unmistakable. The narrow streets, once heavy with the silence of endurance, now carried the muted hum of preparation. Smiths worked openly at their forges, striking iron into shape for spearheads and arrow points. Carpenters fitted fresh shafts for pikes. In the open squares, soldiers gathered in small knots, checking armor and inspecting the edges of their blades. Joan moved among them quietly, her banner folded under her arm. She spoke little, but her presence drew eyes and straightened spines. It was no longer the uncertain curiosity of her first days in Orléans. This was something sharper, the growing recognition that she was not here to endure the siege, but to end it. By midday, she met again with the captains in the town hall. The map of the enemy works lay open on the table, its lines and marks now deeply familiar to them all. Joan's hand rested on the curve of the river where the strongest English positions guarded the key crossings. "They hold the road with these," she said, her voice steady. "They are the chain that binds the siege. Break them, and the rest will falter." The captains listened. Her earlier raids had shown that the English lines could be struck, that they could be forced to yield ground. But this was different. This was not a single blow in the dark. It would be the start of a campaign, each strike weakening the siege until the whole of it gave way. They debated the order of attack, the timing of the assaults, the routes of approach. The air in the room was tight with urgency, but beneath it all there was a current of belief that had not been there before she came. When the meeting ended, Joan stepped back into the winter streets. The sun was low already, its pale light slanting between the high-leaning houses. In the courtyards and alleys she saw men cleaning their weapons by the glow of small fires, others fitting fletching to arrows, others sitting quietly with their thoughts. That evening she climbed the ramparts. The sky was streaked with the last colors of sunset, fading into deep violet above the siege lines. The English watchfires burned in small clusters, each one a reminder of the walls they meant to hold. Joan stood with the banner in her hands, feeling the cold bite of the wind against her face. She thought of the villages she had passed on the way here, the ruined homes, the empty streets, the faces of those who had watched her ride past with silent hope. She thought of the Dauphin and Chinon, waiting for the word that Orléans was free. The voices were close again. They did not speak in sentences this time, but in a sense of direction, a pulling toward what must be done. It was like standing on the edge of a path and knowing without being told which way to go. The bells in the city told the hour, deep and slow. Night settled over Orléans, the cold tightening around its walls. But the fires within burned steady, their light spilling into the dark streets, catching on steel, warming hands ready for the days ahead. The siege had been patient, but now so was the city, patient not in waiting, but in the measured readiness of those who know their turn is coming. And Joan, standing at the highest point of the walls, knew the turn was very near. The morning came gray and sharp, the river mist curling low along the banks. From the walls, Joan could see the English strongpoint ahead, a squat fort of timber and earth braced against the slope. its palisades tipped with frost. It guarded one of the key approaches to the city, a link in the chain that held Orléans tight. The captains had agreed the day before. This would be the first target. Strike here, and the road beyond would open. Strike hard enough, and the English would have to draw men from their other positions to hold the line. The chosen force gathered quietly inside the gate. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, oiled leather, and the faint tang of iron. Men checked their weapons in silence. Joan moved among them, her steps slow, her gaze steady. She carried no rousing speech, no sweeping gesture. Only the white banner furled at her side, waiting for the moment it would rise. At the signal, the gate opened just wide enough to let them slip through. The sound of boots and hooves on frozen ground seemed unnaturally loud against the muffled hush of the mist. Ahead, the fort loomed darker than the sky, its walls a jagged line against the pale morning. They advanced in measured silence until the first call of alarm rose from the palisade. A figure appeared above the wall, then another, their shouts cutting through the cold air. The English scrambled to their posts, but Joan and her company were already upon them. The first wave hit the outer barricade with a crash of steel and splintering wood. Axes bit deep into the timbers, ladders slammed into place. The air filled with the hiss of arrows, the clang of iron on iron, the dull thud of bodies against the palisade. Joan rode to the front, her banner snapping open in the wind. The white cloth blazed against the gray sky, the sacred names bright even in the morning gloom. She called for the men to push forward, her voice carrying above the clash. The wall was breached within minutes. French soldiers poured through, the fight spilling into the heart of the fort. The English fought hard, but they had been caught too quickly, too close. One by one, their lines broke. The order went out to burn the fort. Flames took to the timber hungrily, racing up the walls, hurling around the palisade stakes. Smoke thickened, drifting low across the ground, hiding the shapes of the retreating enemy. Joan stood within the fort's central yard, the banner held high as the fire roared around her. It was not a moment of triumph in her eyes, but of purpose. The first stone pulled from the chain. The signal to withdraw came before the fire had finished its work. The French fell back in good order, slipping once more toward the safety of the city walls. Behind them, the fort's frame groaned as it collapsed inward, sparks flying high into the pale sky. When the company passed back through the gate, the sound of it closing behind them was deep and final. The defenders in the city streets raised their voices in a cheer that rolled along the narrow lanes. They had seen it with their own eyes, the English strong point burning, its hold on the road broken. Later that day, word spread through the city faster than any messenger could carry it. In the markets, in the alleys, in the workshops, people spoke of the fort's fall. The siege had been wounded. The chain was weakening. That evening, Joan returned to the walls. The last of the smoke drifted in the distance, curling faintly over the blackened remains. The enemy's lines still held, but they were not unshaken. The voices came again, quiet but certain. This is the first. The rest will follow. She lowered her gaze to the streets below, where men and women moved with a little more light in their step. The night ahead would still hold the weight of the siege. But for the first time in many long weeks, Orléans slept knowing that the chain could be broken and had begun to break. The day after the first strong point fell, the air around Orléans carried a quiet tension. From the walls, the English lines seemed more watchful now. Their sentries stood in tighter formation, their movements sharper. The smoke from their campfires rose in narrow columns, straight into the cold sky. They knew another strike would come. The question was where and when. Inside the city, the answer was already taking shape. The captains gathered again at the long table in the town hall, the map spread open before them. This time Joan's hand fell not on a weak point, but on a stronger one, a fort guarding the approaches to the river. It was larger than the last, better supplied, and more heavily manned. Taking it would not be as swift nor as simple, but its fall would open the way for movement along the Loire, cutting another link in the siege chain. The decision was made before the light had fully faded. The strike would be launched the next morning, before the frost melted from the grass. At dawn, the city stirred under the toll of the bells. The narrow streets filled with the sound of boots and the muffled clink of armor. Soldiers gathered at the gate, their faces set, their voices low. Joan rode among them, the white banner furled at her side. The gate opened, spilling the company into the pale morning light. Frost still clung to the edges of the road, crunching softly under hooves. The city walls fell behind them. Ahead, the fort loomed dark against the thin winter sky. The English had seen them coming. Shouts rang out from the palisades, the muffled beat of drums carrying faintly over the open ground. Boughs were lifted, arrows knocked, the defenders moving with the discipline of men who had been here long enough to know their craft. The French advanced steadily, shields raised against the first volley. The hiss of arrows filled the air, shafts striking with the flat thud of wood into wood, the sharper ring of steel against armor. When they reached the outer ditch, ladders went up in quick succession. Men swarmed toward the wall, some bearing axes, others clambering with bare hands and boots, gripping the frozen rungs. Joan moved closer, her banner rising into the pale morning. Its white cloth snapped in the wind, the sacred names catching the light. She called for the men to press forward, her voice carrying above the noise of the clash. The fighting at the wall was fierce. The English defenders, struck with polearms, pushed ladders back, loosed arrows at near point-blank range. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat, the shouts of men locked in the press of combat. Bit by bit, the French gained a foothold. A ladder held. A breach opened in the palisade. Through it poured a surge of soldiers, the battle spilling into the inner yard. There the fight became hand to hand, blades striking, shields shoving, boots crunching over frost and broken timber. Joan rode into the yard, the banner streaming above her. It was not a signal to stop, but a mark for her men to rally to, a sign that the heart of the fight was still beating. The tide turned slowly but surely. The English began to give ground, their lines bending under the pressure. Within minutes, the inner defenses crumbled. The order to burn was given. Oil was thrown onto the wooden frames of the siege engines. Torches followed. The fire leapt high, curling black smoke into the cold morning air. The English broke and fled toward their other lines, their figures vanishing into the low mist. Behind them, the fort roared in flame, its timbers groaning as they fell inward. The withdrawal to the city was slower this time. The men were tired, their faces marked with soot and frost, but they carried with them more than victory. They carried proof that even the stronger points in the siege could be broken. When they passed back through the gate, the cheer that met them was louder than before. In the markets, in the narrow alleys, in the open squares, the people spoke of the fort's fall as if a door had swung open. The siege, once a circle of stone and fear, was becoming a chain of broken links. That night, Joan stood again on the ramparts. 2 fires burned beyond the walls now, the blackened ruins of the first fort and the fresh blaze of the second. The enemy lines were still there, still watchful, but they no longer seemed unshakable. The voices were with her again. The chain is weakening. One more and the road will open. Joan closed her eyes, letting the words settle. Tomorrow and the day after there would be more to do. But tonight Orléans breathed easier, its heart beating faster, its hope burning brighter. This was not the start of a battle. This was a final piece being placed. The target was the most formidable stronghold yet, the bastion across the river, known simply as Les Tourelles. It sat like a tooth in the mouth of the siege, guarding the last bridge dug deep into the bank with towers and walls thick with English arms. Joan had seen it days before, studied its lines, felt its pulse, and now she stood with the commanders in the early morning light, the final plan laid bare like bones on a map. The dawn came gold-tinged and tense. River fog coiled through the trees and over the water. The bridge shimmered faintly, just barely visible beyond the glint of armor and fluttering standards. The French crossed early, one contingent by boat, another by the makeshift causeway built under nights of hammering and silence. Every step closer narrowed the gap between hope and ruin. This was not just another fort. This was the anchor, the last breath of the siege. And Joan rode beside them, not shouting, not weeping, but calm. Calm as someone who had already seen the outcome. Her banner rose into the damp morning air like a prophecy. Les Tourelles responded quickly. English cannons barked across the river. Arrows hissed like insects swarming out from the battlements. But the French pressed forward. Shields raised, eyes narrowed against the rising sun and the falling steel. The fighting began on the far back. Smoke rose thick as men surged forward, some scaling, some digging, some lifting fire to the walls. From the tower's narrow windows, the English loosed everything they had, but the line did not falter. Joan climbed from her horse and moved on foot, banner in hand, stepping over broken timber and blackened stones. She stood beside the front ranks, not behind, a flash of steel and a cry. She staggered, struck by an arrow in the shoulder. The French faltered. For a breath, a pause in the surge. But Joan rose, grimacing, but standing. Blood on her arm, but banners still high. She refused retreat, and the line surged again. By afternoon, smoke wrapped the towers. The ground shook with the impact of cannon fire from the French side of the river. A breach appeared in the base of the wall. It cracked like an egg under pressure. Into that opening rushed the wave. Joan did not lead the charge, but she was there, at the breach, watching as the enemy line fractured. Within, the English fought hard. Steel rang on stone, on bone, on armor, but the pressure mounted too fast, too hard. By evening, the tower was taken. French soldiers climbed the final steps, pulling down English flags and throwing them into the smoke below. The last defenders surrendered, their weapons clattering onto the stones. The fire rose through the rafters. The siege shattered. As night came, a hush fell again. But this time it was a hush of disbelief. Orléans stood free. For the first time in months, the gates opened without fear. The people emerged into the streets, holding candles, linking arms, gazing at the sky. The English were leaving. No formal declaration, no ceremony. Just wagons pulled from ditches, tents folded, boots trudging northward, and Joan stood atop the city wall, watching the smoke fade and the river gleam. No speech, no victory cry, just wind brushing her cheek, and voices, soft, warm, familiar. You have done what no one believed you could, but your path is not done, not yet. She lowered her head, closed her eyes, and breathed. The siege of Orléans had begun with silence and sickness. It ended with the girl's voice rising over cannon smoke. A banner gleaming white in the dawn. A city no longer waiting for rescue. History would remember the battle, but in homes across France and soon across Europe, the name Joan began to spread like fire. Not as a soldier, not even as a saint, but as the girl who refused to fall. And in the quiet of the evening, while horses rested and boots dried by the hearth, the people whispered not of war, but of wonder. The fire still lingered in the streets of Orléans, not the kind that burned timber or cloth, but the kind that smoldered behind the eyes of its people, a quiet heat, a warming light that hadn't touched the city in months. The siege was broken, the chains had fallen away, but Joan was already looking beyond the smoke, beyond the river, beyond Orléans, for the voices had not gone silent. They whispered of a journey, not of war, but of recognition, of ceremony, of an anointing that had waited too long. The Dauphin Charles had not yet been crowned. France had no king, not truly, and the voices told Joan that must change. She stood before him in a quiet chamber lit by long afternoon light, her arms still bandaged, her hands folded, the burn of battle not yet faded from her skin, but her resolve already shifting forward. My work is not finished, she said. You must be crowned at Reims. The room grew still. The captains looked to one another, brows heavy with caution. Reims lay far to the northeast, past rivers, past enemy lines, past uncertain loyalties. To travel there meant marching through lands still claimed by the English. It meant trusting in towns not yet tested. It meant stepping into open danger without the certainty of victory. But Joan did not waver. The voices had spoken. The path was clear. In the days that followed, maps were studied, messengers dispatched, armor polished once more. But this time the tension was different. It was not the silence of men waiting for arrows. It was a stillness before a ceremony, like holding breath in a cathedral. The people of Orléans gathered in the streets again, but this time they came not with fear, but with offerings, bread, cloaks, tokens carved from wood, to send with Joan on her journey. They watched her ride out, her banner once again unfurled, but not toward battle, toward something greater. The road to Reims stretched long and winding. It wound through villages scorched by war, fields scattered with broken plows and quiet birdsong. Yet with every step, the path seemed to open. Word of Orléans had moved faster than horses, faster than drums. It flowed through the countryside like river mist. The girl with the banner, the voices from heaven, the city made free. And as the column passed from one town to the next, they found gates unlocked, crowds waiting, bread offered freely, children staring in awe. No army, no matter how trained, could have carved a road so quickly as wonder, and yet it was not all welcome. There were whispers, too, from clergy who doubted, from nobles who watched Joan with wary eyes, a girl in armor, with visions, with power. But Joan met them as she had met the battlefield, not with anger, but with the unshakable stillness of someone walking exactly where they were meant to be. One evening the column camped beside a ruined abbey. The stone walls stood hollow, vines curling through windows open to the stars. Joan sat beside the old altar, staring upward. The voices were quiet now, not absent, but calm, like a whisper echoing through empty halls. You carry the light. The crown waits not for the strongest, but for the faithful. She bowed her head. The wind passed through the trees like breath, and beyond the leaves the sky remained unchanged, a deep violet stretching toward Reims. The road bent gently northward, and with every bend a question. Would the town ahead welcome them or resist? Joan did not ride in armor every day now. Some mornings she walked quietly on foot, her banner folded, her gaze fixed not on the horizon, but on the quiet signs of life returning to the land. A blackbird singing from a broken roof, a field of barley swaying like breath, children watching from behind shuttered windows, eyes wide, unsure if the figure passing was soldier or myth, because word had spread, not just of Orléans, but of the girl who did not speak like generals, who did not rule like lords, who spoke of angels and God and purpose, and who, without threat, walked through cities with her eyes open, and her voice steady. The captains at her side still worried. This road to Reims was not paved with certainty. The English still held strong in nearby towns. Burgundians, loyal to the other crown, patrolled the woods beyond the rivers. But one by one, the cities opened. As they approached Troyes, a city of great pride and deep suspicion, the leaders within hesitated. They feared tricks, feared heresy, feared change. For days the army camped outside its walls. Tensions simmered beneath canvas tents. Some spoke of siege, others of retreat. But Joan simply waited. She walked the fields beside the city. She prayed. She did not shout or demand. And slowly the gates opened, not to fire, but to conversation. The Bishop of Troyes came to her tent, tall, stern, his voice stiff as parchment. You claim divine guidance, and yet you wear no crown, you hold no holy office. Why should we listen? Joan looked at him as she would look at a tree, not defiant, not afraid, but rooted. I speak only what I hear, she said, and I do not ask that you believe me, only that you see what has already happened. She said nothing more, but within a day Troyes opened its gates. No blood spilled, no walls breached, only hearts softening. At every stop the legend grew deeper, more than just a tale of victory. Now it was a mystery. Who was this girl? How could a peasant lead princes? How did the wind always seem to be at her back? The answers Joan would not give. She never tried to explain herself, only to obey. She slept on straw when needed, ate little, spoke softly, but always kept walking. There was a night near Chalons-sur-Marne when the army camped in a clearing under a sky lit with silver stars. Joan stood beside a fire, warming her hands, silent. One of the younger knights approached. Do you ever wonder if you'll succeed? Joan did not answer at first. She looked into the flame. It crackled softly, painting her face in gold and shadow. I already have, she said, and walked away. The road to Reims had once seemed impossible, but now it was simply a matter of time. Each mile brought not resistance, but quiet surrender, not to violence, but to something older, something deeper, faith, hope, the belief that perhaps God had not abandoned them after all. And in the center of it all, a teenage girl, walking through history, as if through a dream. The walls of Reims rose like a vision in the mist, not a fortress of war, but of memory, a place where kings had been crowned for centuries, beneath vaulted arches and the gaze of angels carved in stone. Joan rode at the front, her banner lifted not in challenge but in offering. The people of Reims did not close their gates. They did not demand proof. They opened the city to her, as if they had been waiting for her all along. Bells rang, not warning bells, not cries of alarm, but deep, resonant notes of welcome, one after another, a rolling wave of sound that echoed off rooftops and danced between cathedral towers. Joan dismounted at the edge of the square. She looked up at the great cathedral, its windows lit like colored fire, and its doors open wide. This was the place. The Dauphin arrived hours later. He had followed behind more cautiously, watching each town's reaction from a safer distance. But Reims was calm, open, quiet in its joy. When he stepped inside the city, no trumpet played, no soldier called out. Instead, the people fell to their knees, and the silence that followed was filled with meaning. Joan stood beside him. She did not bow. She simply looked at him and said, "You were born for this." And for once, he believed it. Preparations moved quickly. There was no time for weeks of ceremony. The anointing oil had already been brought from St. Remy, the sacred instruments of coronation, cleaned, repaired, made ready, and the people, they lined the streets not out of obligation, but wonder, as if they were watching the end of a drought and the return of rain. The night before the coronation, Joan walked alone through the cathedral. The great nave stretched above her, vaulted stone arches twisting toward the heavens. Candles flickered in long rows, golden light against shadowed walls. Her footsteps echoed, a girl in armor, alone in the house of kings. She paused beneath the rose window, color filtered down in soft hues, deep crimson, violet, gold. She closed her eyes, and the voices came again. This is not your ending. This is only the sign. He will be crowned, and still the path will continue. She nodded. They were right, but in her heart, she allowed herself this moment, a moment of peace, a pause before the next fire. At dawn, the bells began again, a soft peal at first, then stronger, then louder, until the whole city pulsed with sound. Joan stood at the cathedral door. Her banner rolled tightly in her hand. She did not enter first. She waited until Charles, the Dauphin, walked past her in royal robes that still fit awkwardly. He was not yet the man the moment demanded, but the crown would change that. She followed behind, and the light poured in from high windows. Like the breath of heaven itself, the ceremony was long, and to many it was just ritual, but to Joan it was fulfillment. Each step, each word, each drop of oil upon his forehead was prophecy made real, and when the crown was lifted and placed upon Charles's head, a hush fell over the cathedral. Time paused, the air grew still, and in that silence, Joan lowered her banner and knelt, not before a king, but before a promise kept. The crown sat upon Charles's head, golden and heavy, a relic of kings past, and yet he did not look transformed. He smiled and bowed to the gathered crowd, but his eyes remained uncertain. For Joan, it was different. She had seen what she came to see, done what she was sent to do. The voices were quiet now, not gone, but distant, as if watching from far away. She stood at the edge of the cathedral, as people sang and cheered, as banners waved, as history turned its page. But within her there was stillness. Later, as the new king feasted, Joan sat in a quieter room, no jewels, no throne, only candlelight and the smell of old stone. A priest sat with her, his robes worn thin from years of use. He studied her face, not with suspicion, but with awe. "You have done what few dared dream," he said. "You have brought the crown to Reims." Joan shook her head slowly. "I only followed the path I was given." The priest leaned forward. "And what now? What path remains?" She looked at her hands, calloused, burned in places from battle, still trembling, though the sword had long been sheathed. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I feel it is not over." And she was right. The coronation had not ended the war. The English still held towns. The Burgundians still circled. The king, for all his new title, still hesitated, still wavered, still waited. Joan had moved like lightning, but Charles, he drifted like mist. Days passed. The court settled into politics. Letters were written, counselors argued, maps were unfolded. Joan stood at the edges of the room, no longer the central flame, but a flickering candle in the corner. The king thanked her often, called her a miracle, promised rewards. But when she asked to march again, to press forward, to seize the moment, he delayed. There is time, he would say. There are things to consider. And slowly, she began to feel the weight of waiting. She still rode in armor, still prayed daily, still heard the saints and whispers in dreams. But now, her fire flickered against damp walls, and doubt, like a creeping fog, began to rise. Not within her, but around her, among the nobles, among the generals, among those who had once bowed but now turned away. When she entered the room, there were whispers. She had done her part. She had played her role. And now perhaps it was time for her to go. But Joan did not come for reward. She did not come to sit in halls or dine with princes. She had come for France, and France was not yet whole. One morning she rode alone beyond the city walls into the open fields. The sky was overcast, the wind cold, birdsong absent. She dismounted, stood in the center of the field, closed her eyes, and the silence answered. Not with voices, not with thunder, just wind and stillness and the long breath of the earth. She knelt there, palms on the ground, armor creaking softly, as she bowed her head, and she spoke not to saints, but to herself. I am not finished, she said. I will not be finished until the land is free. And with that, she rose, dusted herself off, and returned to the court with purpose in her step. The crown had been claimed, but the silence afterward was heavy. He had become king. Now she would remind him how to lead. The halls of power had grown quiet, not silent like the chapel, but quiet like a room where the truth is no longer welcome. A hush laced with doubt, with strategy, with hesitation. Joan had once moved through these chambers like a flame, bright, unquestioned, burning through fear. Now her steps echoed differently, slower, not uncertain, but watched. The king, no longer a dauphin, but crowned Charles VII, sat in polished robes, his crown catching the pale light. But with his new title came a new stillness. He had risen, and now he sat. And around him gathered those who had never bled beside Joan, never prayed with her in the mud, never seen the gates of Orléans through smoke and flame, men of velvet and silk, whisperers, calculators. They praised her in public, called her the savior of France, a divine vessel. But when she spoke, they shifted in their seats. They folded their hands, they smiled and moved on. She brought maps to the table, pointed to Paris. Let us strike now. The people will rise. They nodded politely. The chancellor adjusted his spectacles. There is unrest, my lady. Paris is complicated. She pointed to Normandy, to the remaining English strongholds. Another noble leaned back with a sigh. We must consolidate. There are treaties being drafted. Each word like snow on fire. Each delay, a door quietly closing. Still, she tried. Letters were written. Troops gathered. But nothing moved with the swiftness she had once known. And at night, in her chamber, she knelt and whispered, "Are you still with me?" The saints did not answer as they had before. Not in thunder, not in fire, only in quiet nudges, a feeling in her chest, a still certainty, like a candle that would not go out. She rode again, led a small force to Compiègne, a city under threat. There was no grand army this time, no royal banner beside hers, just a cluster of loyal men, believers, veterans, farmers with old swords, and priests with eyes full of memory. They did not need gold to follow her, only conviction. And in the cold air, as spring turned to early summer, they marched. The road was narrower than before. Fewer towns welcomed them with cheers. Some gates remained shut, some windows closed as they passed. Not all hearts stay lifted, even after miracles. And France was tired, wounded, afraid to hope again. But Joan still burned. Compiègne loomed ahead, the sky dark as smoke, the wind shifting. The English had tightened their grip, and the Burgundians, once uncertain, now circled like vultures. She arrived as the city braced itself, the people fearful, the walls half-manned. She did not promise safety. She promised resistance, and they followed. The gate shut behind her, with a sound like finality, but she did not flinch. She had entered many cities, some in victory, some in fire, but always with purpose. She walked the streets as dusk fell, her armor dusted with the ash of travel. Children peeked from behind barrels. Old men crossed themselves, and someone whispered, "That's her." Not a warrior, not a witch, just her, Joan, the maid. At the cathedral steps she paused. The bells had not rung. No time for celebration. Instead, she looked up at the sky. Purple clouds streaking overhead, the wind stronger now, sharp. She breathed it in, the scent of wood smoke, sweat, and something else, a turning. She knew it. The wind had shifted. And soon, everything else would too. Morning in Compiègne broke without birdsong. A heavy mist clung to the fields beyond the walls, as if the land itself did not want to be seen. Joan stood on the ramparts, her gloved hands gripping the cold stone. Below her, the enemy stirred. The English banners moved like phantoms in the haze, and among them, the red cross of the Burgundians, once allies, now traitors. Or perhaps they had never truly been friends. Her men waited inside the gates, small in number but not in spirit. They were the faithful ones, the stubborn ones, too tired to fear, too loyal to run. Joan turned to them with calm eyes. "This will not be Orléans," she said. "There will be no rescue. We ride out to strike and then we return." They nodded. Some made the sign of the cross. Some kissed tokens from home. But none said no. The plan was simple. Quick sortie. Disrupt the enemy. Buy the city time and then fall back. Joan had done this before. But something felt different. They rode out as the sun broke through the mist, casting golden streaks across the battlefield. But the gold did not reach her. Her thoughts were distant, not with the saints, but with the silence between them. Were they warning her? Had she misunderstood? Or was this simply the price of following light into darkness? She tightened her grip on the reins and focused on the task. No fear, no doubt, only purpose. The clash was sudden. Screams tore through the morning, the clang of steel, the thunder of hooves. Joan led the charge, her banner high, cutting through the Burgundian line, like a knife through frost. Her men fought beside her, not behind. One fell, then two, but the others pressed forward. A small victory was forming. A push, a breach, a crack in the enemy's shape. And then the horn blew. Behind her, from the city, she turned. The gate, it was closing. Too early, too soon. No, she cried, spurring her horse back toward safety. But the drawbridge had lifted. The iron gate had fallen, and the road home was gone. She wheeled around, looked for cover, looked for allies. Only scattered men, broken formations, and behind them, encircling fast, the enemy, a trap, so clean, so well laid, and she had ridden straight into it. Still, she did not flee. She rallied what few remained, drew her sword, raised her banner. "We stand," she shouted. "We hold." They formed a ring around her, not for glory, not for France, but for her, for the one who had once walked through fire, the one who had led them across rivers and into cities, the girl in armor with the voice of angels. The Burgundians closed in, shields high, faces grim. A rock struck her shoulder. Then a lance split her standard. Still she stood, until from behind an arm gripped tight. She twisted, struggled, shouted. Another pulled her from the saddle. The earth rose up hard beneath her. Iron hands, chains, silence. And then she was still. The battle faded. Her men were gone, or dead, or scattered. And she was no longer free. They dragged her from the field. Not roughly, not cruelly, as if she were something fragile, a relic to be preserved. Burgundian voices muttered, some in awe, some in scorn. "The witch is caught," one said. "No," another replied, "the saint." That night she sat in a tent, chained but upright, her hands folded in prayer, not for escape, not for vengeance, but for clarity. What now? What next? The voices did not come, but the candle in her chest still glowed, faint, flickering, but alive. She was not down, even if the world thought otherwise. The walls of her cell were not cruel, not at first. Stone, yes, cold and damp, but not lined with spikes or fire. This was not the dungeon of nightmares, but something quieter, more subtle. Joan sat in a wooden chair, hands bound lightly in front of her. A single candle lit the space, enough to cast shadows, but not enough to chase them. She was no longer on the field. There was no sword at her side, no banner in her hand, no hoofbeat under her. Only her breath, and the sound of others beyond the door, beyond her reach. The Burgundians held her now, not the English, not yet, and for days they did not ask questions. They watched, studied, whispered outside her walls. She was not tortured, not harmed, but she was alone, utterly. Even the voices, those radiant celestial visitors, were quiet, still. Had they abandoned her? Was this a test? Was silence its own command? They came eventually, priests in fine robes, nobles with soft voices, a scribe who never looked her in the eye. They asked politely. "Who are you really? Do you still claim to hear voices? Do you understand the danger you are in?" She answered gently, as she always had. "I am Joan, sent by God. I did what I was told." They asked again and again and again, until the questions sounded like prayers, but hollow and without faith. Outside the cell, deals were being made. The Burgundians had her, but the English wanted her, not for ransom, not for trade. They wanted her name, her story, her miracle. To break her in public was to rewrite the war. To say the Maid was no saint was to say France had risen on false wings. The price was agreed. Joan of Arc, captured in Compiègne, was sold to the English for 10,000 livres, coins for courage, silver for a soul. She was moved in silence, from one fortress to another, then again and again, always under guard, always in the night, as if daylight might protest. Rusing, that was the end of the road. A city loyal to the English, a castle with iron gates, and a court already waiting. The trial had not begun, but her judges were in place. Her interrogators rehearsed. They did not want truth. They wanted confession, not in blood, but in words. She was housed in a tower, guarded not by nuns, but by English soldiers. A violation of custom and of decency. She was 19. She had led armies, but now she slept in a cell with 3 guards and no peace. They watched her dress, watched her eat, watched her pray, and still she did not break. She asked to see a priest, a real one who came without politics in his mouth, but they denied her. She asked for Mass. They refused. She asked for solitude. They laughed. But every day she knelt and whispered to God, to Michael, to Catherine, to Margaret, to whoever might still be listening. Her hair had grown longer, her hands rougher, but her eyes stayed bright. When the guards mocked her, she stayed still. When the wind howled through the cracks, she closed her eyes, and when the candle flickered, she let its light fall. On her open palms, the voices had not returned, but they had not left either. They were there in her stillness, in her breath, in her refusal to become what they claimed she was. They wanted her to fear, to despair, to undo herself before the trial began. But Joan was not built that way. She had seen angels. She had heard bells that no one else could hear. She had stood on battlefields and never flinched. A cell would not change her. A silence would not unmake her. She waited as the wind turned cold again, as winter crept toward Rouen, as the trial, that slow, brutal machine, prepared its gears, and still she knelt, and still she listened, because even if they never spoke again, the saints had once said, "Be brave. You were born for this." The hall in Rouen was cold, not from wind, not from stone, but from the men who filled it. They wore robes of authority. They carried books like weapons. They called themselves judges, but their eyes held no curiosity, only conclusion. Joan stood at the center, chained at the ankles, a wooden stool beneath her, a dozen eyes fixed upon her, like hammers upon glass. She was 19. dirt beneath her fingernails, armor long gone, hair cropped short by order of her captors, and yet she held herself like a queen, not in pride, but in stillness, not in defiance, but in clarity. The Bishop of Beauvais presided, Pierre Couchon, a man who wore his faith like a mask, and his allegiance to the English like perfume. He called the trial holy, but it began with chains. He claimed to seek truth, but his questions were snares. They asked about the voices. When did they come to you? What did they sound like? Were they truly saints? Could they have been demons instead? Joan answered with patience. They were bright, they were kind, they spoke of God's will, and France's freedom. They pressed again. Did they speak in French? Did they ever lie? Did they tell you to wear men's clothes? She did not falter. They were from heaven. They never lied. And I wore what protected me. They took notes, whispered, looked for weakness. She gave them none. When they tried to trick her with complex theology, she smiled. If I am not sure, she said, may God teach me. When they accused her of pride, she bowed her head. All glory is his, she whispered. And when they mocked her for her silence, she looked up, meeting their eyes, and said nothing at all. Days passed, then weeks. The trial grew stranger, not law, but theater, not inquiry, but indictment. Each question a blade, each answer a test. But Joan was the storm before it breaks, not loud, not raging, just unmoved. They read letters, some real, some forged. They brought in witnesses, some honest, some paid. They twisted her words, rephrased her answers. They tried to force her into a corner. She would not build. They accused her of heresy, of witchcraft, of pride, of defying the church. But she did not claim to lead the church, only to obey what God had asked. I am not against the church, she said, but I listened first to God. To them, that was enough. Rebellion, in a girl's voice. They offered her freedom. If she confessed, if she recanted, say the voices were false, they said. Say you were wrong. Say it was pride. Say you were sorry. But Joan had not come this far to rewrite truth into comfort. My voices are from God, she said quietly. To say otherwise would be to lie. Still, the pressure mounted. They moved her to a dark room, weakened her meals, kept her from sleep, told her execution was near, that her ashes would be scattered. In the same, the candlelight in her spirit flickered. For a moment, only a moment, she was afraid, not of death, but of silence, of being forgotten. Then came the offer again. A paper to sign, a confession prepared. Admit the visions were lies. Admit the voices were madness. Live, she stared at the parchment, the ink, the quill. Then at her hands, rough, tired, calloused from war and prayer. In chains, she signed, but the paper was a trap, not mercy, not escape. A brief reprieve, then worse confinement. A dress forced upon her, mockery from her guards, isolation deeper than before. Her heart knew she had denied her calling, not to save herself, but to stop the pain, and yet the pain did not stop. The voices returned, not angry, not disappointed, but firm. "You were born for this," they whispered. "Do not be afraid." Joan stood again, asked for her clothes, her armor, and with that act, quiet and deliberate, she undid the confession. They seized her, declared her relapsed, a heretic once more. Now there would be no more questions, only fire. She did not weep, not when they read her sentence, not when they tied her hands, not even when they built the stake in the market square, because by then Joan knew what could not be burned. Her story was already beyond them, beyond this city, beyond this time. It had taken root in memory and faith and legend, and so ends the trial, but not the tale, because what was meant to destroy her only spread the fire. Further,